The orbitals above Inquisitorial headquarters were a colossal mess, straining the cogitators of orbital traffic control to their limit. It wasn't just the presence of the task force mustering to counterattack the sudden Tyranid incursion, or the tense standoff between the rogue Inquisitor's semi-surrendered battleship and the Inquisitorial fleet. It wasn't even the frenzy of shuttle traffic, as the Inquisition mustered its ground forces and the PDF scrambled to bring themselves to something approaching readiness. No, it was all that, plus the steadily increasing volume of merchant vessels pouring into the system in search of news, safety, and highly profitable motorpool contracts. It was all OrbTravCon could do to keep the civilian vessels corralled, even with the prospect of the Inquisition and Navy's zero-strike policies backing them up. Given the mess, it wasn't surprising that the stubby merchant vessel's arrival went unnoticed. The free trader Event Horizon, as its IFF beacon identified it, popped out of the warp at a noticeable angle to its own portal, accompanied by a restrained burst of malevolent psychic energy. With all but the most expendable astropaths locked in their sanctums, shielding their sensitive minds from the Tyranid warp shadow shrouding the system, nobody noticed the event, or the subsequent change in the warp shadow shrouding the system, as its source translated into real space. Between its falsified beacon and a cunningly disguised emission profile, via the replacement of 2 engines, the complete absence of another, and a persistent atmosphere leak from somewhere on deck 6, maybe 9, if, the screen's upside down, the occurrence border slipped into orbit almost completely unnoticed by Inquisitorial headquarters. The Trial of Inquisitor Oak. Along with the standard station-keeping comms, polite inquiries into the stability of the ship's reactor, and unsolicited refit contract offers, the occurrence border received a single mundane communique from the Administrative Auxiliary Liaison Office. Among other things, the message contained a pre-filled form for the return of misfiled evidential materials and directions for its immediate filing. This form was printed, signed, and submitted via second-hand Astartes stealth shuttle. The stealth shuttle attracted even less notice than the ship it departed from, which was entirely the point. It skipped into the steady stream of shuttle traffic, moving between the mustering Imperial fleet and the staging area on the outskirts of Inquisitorial headquarters. Landing on the edge of the vast muddy field that had until recently contained the Inquisitorial Penal Legion, the shuttle's occupants disembarked and split into 3 groups. The Rupert led his team towards the command building, formerly belonging to the Commissariat, now hosting Lady General von Huppending and her sizable retinue. Jim and Hannah split off too, following their own directions to a meeting at the HQ Shrine Primaris. The final team, consisting of 6 HQ stormtroopers, an official Inquisition-sanctioned psyker, a servo grok skull, and a single standard-issue evidence box, headed for the compound exit. The security checkpoint at the gate had changed drastically with the departure of the Penal Legion, the typical pair of bored Commissariat cadets having been replaced with 2 squads of highly alert Inquisitorial stormtroopers. What the security detail didn't have, though, was a psyker, and as Sarge stepped forwards to offer his credentials, he signaled Fumbles to get ready for the critical moment he'd been practicing for all week. Things then took an abrupt turn as the stormtrooper sergeant on duty abruptly pointed a finger at Sarge and yelled, "It's you, assholes!" Sarge's well-honed mind abruptly leapt into panicked panicking, as he blatantly recognised the same sergeant that had been on duty at the evidence building's entrance. Fortunately, before he could do anything catastrophically stupid, the approaching stormtrooper non-com did something completely unexpected, holding out a hand and pulling Sarge into a back-slapping hug when he reflexively took it. To our squad's collective amazement, all of the stormtroopers present started flipping up their helmet visors and talking excitedly. The gist was that when the dust had settled, after Inquisitor Big Hat's failed infiltration, the MIA and KIA lists had been impressively long and we'd definitely been on them. We, as in us. Us personally, by name, rank, and biometric ID code. Sarge desperately prevented himself from glaring at Tink, whose fault this definitely was, and tried to take solace in the fact that he'd apparently received an inquisitorial decoration for practicality, posthumous, for getting all the scribes out. There were, of course, some questions mixed in with the camaraderie. Fortunately, this being the Inquisition, Sarge's flat denial that anything had actually happened, at all, ever, anywhere, was accepted with good humour. To Amy's annoyance, the stormtroopers also recognised her, but since they immediately congratulated her on getting out of the commissariat and back into the guard proper, she took it with good grace. An inquiry into the love-struck stormtrooper LT revealed that the little tit was fortunately not around. Even better, since the idiot has spent most of the intervening time trying to send Amy courtship inquiries, via her mother's office, which made it even better, the sergeant was only too willing to keep him in the dark about our little visit. To Fumble's relieved disappointment, the plan no longer called for him to mindfog us past a team of highly trained and heavily armed inquisitorial stormtroopers. Instead, our infiltration was accomplished by asking the stormtroopers for directions where to take our misfiled evidence form, and being provided with a helpful guide in the form of the familiar wheelchair-bound good scribe, they even threw in one of those electric cars for driving around groups that are too important and or fat to walk places themselves. Tink was not allowed to drive. The tall train full of stormtroopers zipped through the service tunnels of Inquisitorial headquarters, the passengers blissfully unaware of the sinister bureaucratic plot choreographing their every movement. The good scribe, who was very much aware of how much effort had gone into prearranging their passage through the heart of inquisitorial authority, because he'd been the one who had to do most of it, resisted the urge to point it out to the oblivious infiltration team. The scribe took solace in the fact that despite a century of paper-pushing for the Inquisition instead of honest spy work, he could still run, or at least roll, with the best of them. Realization that all was not as it seemed hit the team when the good scribe took us not to an office, but a small break room, with a bunch of inquisitorial adepts blocking the door. The scribe politely shooed a gap through the crowd, and opened the door before anyone could ask any questions, unleashing a choking billow of smoke that drove back the inquisitorial hangers-on. Grateful for the full helmet and rebreather on his carapace armor, Sarge scanned the smoke-filled rooms for threats, and flinched as something shot through the air towards him. Sarge's instinctive duck got him out of the way in time, which just meant that Doc caught the half-full ashtray right in the faceplate. As the medic staggered and wiped ash off his visor, a banshee-like voice screeched at us to either piss off or close the damn door before we let all the warm air out. One of the inquisitorial adepts outside grimly wished us luck before shutting the door behind us. The screeching ashtray thrower was the break room's only occupant, unless you counted the half-empty carton of smokes, and as the door slammed shut behind us, recognition hit. The familiar old lady adept, last seen pushing an evidence cart full of parking tickets at our brief inquisitorial trial, jumped up from her seat and grumpily informed us she'd been on smoke break for nearly 2 hours now. What looked to be the exact same evidence cart sat parked in the room's corner, with a matching evidence box perched on top of it. Sarge sighed with relief that the plan, whatever it was, hadn't changed, and waved Fumbles forward with the box he'd been keeping everyone from noticing. Under the cover of a screeching rant about being owed years of smoke breaks, and the goal of sending a squad of stormtroopers to muscle a little old lady around, the switch was made. Both boxes were unceremoniously opened and shaken out, and then Tink carefully removed the false bottom from the one we bought. Sweating under the gazes of everyone present, Tink transplanted the techno-heretical amalgamation of Imperial circuits, Tau Xenotech, and oddly greenish lumps of Wraithbone. The Necron tesseract perched in the middle wobbled slightly in its suspensor field, sending the little yellow note stuck to it declaring, "Do not touch, this means you, Tink," flying off as it brushed the edge of the field. Tink assured everyone that the note had been more of a suggestion, and gave the ancient archaeotech device a good poke to prove his point. Sarge instructed him to knock it off if he wanted to keep those fingers, and the swap was completed without further incident. Once the slightly battered false bottom was replaced, and the jumbled pile of evidence had been crammed back into place, the feisty old adept grabbed it from us and led the way back out the door. The crowd of inquisitorial adepts staking out the break room were dispersed via the simple expedient of Sarge telling them to get lost. We would be escorting Curatoress Dench, who resented being either called old or lady, and her evidence cart on their delayed journey to, wherever. The dispersal was only temporary, and probably had more to do with the Curatoresses haranguing them for impatience, rudeness, impropriety, and lack of both personal hygiene and dress sense. The assorted inquisitorial flunkies were visibly relieved as Sarge unceremoniously loaded both her and the cart. The chumps didn't realise they weren't being invited aboard until our tour train abruptly zipped off, the curatoress cackling madly as she floored it. In the silence that followed, the wheelchair-riding scribe congratulated the confused adepts on a job well done, and helpfully volunteered to guide them all back to their respective retinues. The Inquisitorial Administrative Auxiliary Administrator's office was feeling distinctly cramped with 3 interrogators, one from each Ordos, glaring futilely at the small-robed man and the 2 evidence boxes on his desk. Administrator Jurisprudence Property Tact was no stranger to being glared at. In fact, as a lifelong adept of Departamento Diplomatum, he considered it a sign of a job well done. These specific glares were substandard though, comparing poorly to multiple lifetimes' worth of infuriated dignitaries, secessionists, and Xenos. Not to mention some rather acrimonious encounters with the Officio Assassinorum, Tau Counterintelligence, and an enraged Bloodaxe Lordish General. Even Inquisitor Sergeant, who'd catastrophically failed all his body language and non-verbal projection lessons, could pull off a better glare than the 3 interrogators, but then again, the man did have quite a bit of practice. Of course, Administrator Tact hadn't expected much from the 3 flunkies sent to harass him over the delay of the all-important evidence of Inquisitor Oak's flagrant fiscal maleficence. All 3 interrogators, or at least their inquisitors, were well aware of how much of the subsector's inquisitorial bureaucracy had been seconded to the administrative auxiliary, as well as Tact's early reappointment to the rotating position by order of the Lord Inquisitor, following the recent colossal frack-ups. What they were less aware of was just how many of their own decisions were based entirely on the auxiliary's own reports and scheduling assignments. Arranging to get 3 weasels who all hated each other wasn't particularly hard, but he took pride in managing to stick 2 known conspiracy psychers in a room with an Ordos Malleus untouchable for several hours. Maintaining the vaguely helpful expression he knew annoyed the self-important little shits, Administrator Tact assured them that the last evidence box would be arriving shortly. Said evidence box nearly flew off its cart as the tour train skidded to a stop in the oddly empty heart of the local inquisitorial bureaucracy. Ignoring Twitch's pointed questions about where everyone was, the curatoress took a moment to inspect her troops, adjusting Sergeant Amy's uniforms, as well as her own hair and cosmetics, and shooing Nubby to the back of the line, with instructions to try and stand behind other people. Satisfied with the appearance of her honor guard, the crafty old biddy dragged Fumbles to the front of the group with her, and set off at a brisk trot for the slightly fancier door at the end of the hall labelled Administrator. Next to her, Fumbles started to sweat, then stagger, gamely pushing on and almost reaching the door, before collapsing in a twitching heap. Whatever the 3 interrogators in the office had expected, it was not a wizened little woman in scribe's robes bursting through the door like an Astartes assault squad, screechily vowing to break her foot off in the ass of whichever irredeemably rude untouchable was walking around without their limiter on. After the brief moment of panic caused by the sudden entrance, all 3 interrogators holstered the weapons they'd drawn, and the Ordo Malleus interrogator sheepishly activated her limiter. The 2 psychically gifted interrogators, having spent nearly 2 hours pointedly not mentioning the obvious, tried not to visibly sag with relief, as the oppressive anti-psycho aura abated. And try not to look too smug, as their hated colleague was forced to apologize to the cute little psycho boy. For us grunts, the hardest part of the next several minutes was trying not to stare at the damned diplomacy adept as he sat there claiming to be this important Inquisition bigwig and bossing around free interrogators. Or at least watching as his, accomplice? Minion? Agent was probably the best term for the retaliation between our two former adepts, or possibly protege, judging by the occasional proud looks the curatoress was shooting him. Whatever their relation, the administrator seemed happy to play good cop to her angry Shuttle mistress, calmly taking possession of the third evidence box and walking the free interrogators through the process of observing and certifying the evidence transfer. What was supposed to happen was a careful inventory and inspection of all items in the free boxes, with the interrogators verifying that all items were present, correct, and free of any warpcraft before presentation to the High Conclave. In reality, the careful inventory was more of a high-speed rubber stamping, as the administrator whipped out item after item, reading out numbers and descriptions without pausing for input from the free inquisitorial observers. The pace didn't slow until we reached the third box, opening it to reveal the disorganized jumble we'd piled into it. Seizing the opportunity to be an asshole, the Hereticus interrogator asked whether the box had been packed by a trained scribe or a drunken guardsman. He did not seem amused when the administrator asked Sarge if he and his men were sober, before shrugging off the entirely legitimate and incredibly suspicious issue with an "honestly, it's not that bad for a guardsman," and proceeding with the inventory before anyone else could interrupt. Of course, the real problem with the whole inspection process was that the two psychers had just spent an extended time around the Inquisition's rudest untouchable and were in no condition to psychically verify anything. The solution was obvious though, as the curatoress immediately pointed out, because she had a qualified Inquisition-sanctioned psyker right here, and would they rather keep their inquisitors waiting even longer while they took a refreshing nap or something? Fumbles had prepared for this, actually practicing in everything. Under the highly unnerving gaze of two highly trained and experienced Inquisition psychers, he truthfully asserted that there was nothing warpy about any of the evidence. To our relief, and the administrator's disgust, none of the interrogators even bothered to question Fumbles, seeming far more interested in sniping at each other about who should be blamed if something went wrong. Before any of the free interrogators remembered to do their job properly, both of the elderly spies turned bureaucrats seized the initiative, the curatoress elbowing past them and putting everything back in the boxes, while the administrator grabbed an ancient vox set, cleared his throat, and announced that recess will be ending shortly, over the HQ's vox system. Judging by the panicked look on the free interrogators' faces, they'd been anticipating an hour or two more of bureaucratic time wasting, and probably a chance to report the news personally to their respective inquisitors and scoring some brown-nose points. The Hereticus one was even dumb enough to complain about the administrator's unilateral decision, earning him a withering suggestion to go ask the Lord Inquisitor if he'd been serious about sorting things out as quickly as possible. The other two interrogators snickered, and then all three set about signing their respective stacks of forms, and applying official order seals to the free evidence boxes. The evidence convoy was reformed, larger by two boxes, three interrogators, and one annoyingly smug diplostrator, and thus the final phase of our covert operation began. To our surprise, the hardest part of getting our tampered evidence boxes into Oak's trial wasn't talking our way past security, who just waved us all through when they saw the administrator, or maintaining our stormtroopy facade in front of the unwitting interrogators. Well, actually it was, but not in the sense of acting professionally, and not gawking at Inquisition's inner sanctum like a bunch of pilgrims. No, the actual hard part was maintaining the damn perimeter without shooting anyone. Administrator Tack's announcement had unleashed something like a shift change in a hive, with inquisitorial agents of every type running in every direction. At first, it wasn't an issue, with the presence of the administrator and free interrogators keeping the riffraff at bay, but that changed abruptly when we entered the Hollow Hall. The sepulchre of the disavowed dead, to give the massive gothic monstrosity of a room its proper name, was supposed to be a place of prayer and reflection. A place where a young, budding paranoid could ponder the deeds, deaths, and stasis-suspended remains of the subsector's greatest inquisitorial heroes. What it actually was something between a daycare and a guard muster field, with the collected retinues of 19 inquisitors split into separate, heavily armed camps and positioned around the room based on their boss's opinion of the various big holographic dead guys. With all the inquisitors called back into the high inquisitorium for the trial, a vague semblance of order was being maintained by the assorted interrogators. Just like any guard muster, though, there was only so much one could do to prevent fraternization of one sort or another. It wasn't just the usual poker games and the inquisitorial equivalent of nubby making the rounds. There were also dozens of little inter-retinue groups doing everything from drinking, to xenobiological trivia contests, to roasting a whole grox on a makeshift spit. The largest groups by far were the Emperor Botherers, though, having set up a good dozen little congregations, ranging from a large and orderly collection of battle sisters hymning away over the altar of some saint, which they presumably brought with them, to a robe-wearing ogrim preaching to a flock of psychers and twists about the glorious bigness of the Emperor. Needless to say, our little convoy caught the attention of just about everyone present, it being the first actual interesting thing to happen in the last several hours, and a steadily growing crowd formed around us, and our charge. Lacking the self-preservation the Emperor gave an ogrim, the unruly mob of inquisitorial agents, and yes, it was definitely a mob, responded to Sarge's bellows to make way either with annoyed indifference or by actively coming closer to check out what was going on. The three interrogators were worse than useless, chatting with acquaintances in the crowd, while the convoy ground to a near halt, at least until the curatoress reached over and turned the Malleus Untouchable's limiter back off. Doc caught the collapsing fumbles without missing a beat, and Sarge gave the order to clear the way and keep the violence to a medium. It turned out to be Tink who had the hardest job of the escort detail. As Guardsmen, we were all fully qualified when it came to angry shouting, inventive cursing, and semi-targeted violence, albeit a bit half-heartedly on Doc's part, and over-enthusiastically on Nubby and Amy's. Twitch was just glad to finally have a situation where brandishing a las pistol while screaming at everyone to stay back was not only allowed, but actively encouraged. Tink, though, was stuck dealing with the increasing numbers of cyberskulls, cherubs, aquilay, and anything else a cockboy was willing to staple an anti-grav unit onto. Worryingly, Tink's initial attempts to fend them off using Spot 3.0's jamming field just redirected the cyberstalker's attention to his drone. Incredibly belatedly, Tink realized that he'd never seen an actual servo-grot skull himself, and it might not have been his best choice of disguise for his massively techno-heretical xenotech toy. Panicking more than a little, Tink set his equally techno-heretical plasma gun to fry and hosed the airspace. This had, as literally anyone else could have predicted, the exact same result as his first ploy. Fortunately, before Tink could blow the entire mission single-handedly, Jim and Hannah's part of the plan kicked in. From 1 minute to the next, the flock of assorted flying bullshit dropped by 3/4, as without a fuss or anything so primitive as a spoken word to their inquisitorial colleagues, every single copboy in the room left to go take off Mechanicus business. Tink smugly declared victory, and turned the much smaller job over to Twitch and his comparatively standard-issue las pistol. At least it was easy to find the correct exit from the massive room, there being only one with an entire platoon of Ordo Malleus stormtroopers stationed in front of it. As our convoy approached, the Malleus boys kept us covered like proper guardsmen. Unlike all the headquarters stormtroopers we met so far, they didn't just wave us through at the sight of Tact and the interrogators. In a gratifying show of proper guard security procedures, their LT held up a hand to stop us a good 20 meters out and waved forwards 2 troopers with gene scanners, as well as a sapper with a full detection kit. To the mutual disgust of us and the Malleus stormtroopers, not to mention Tact, who spent quite a bit of effort getting our gene codes re-registered, the untouchable interrogator waved the inspection team off. At their inquisitorial superior's order, the stormtroopers grudgingly let us through, the LT behaving and responding in the stiff parade ground fashion of sulky junior officers everywhere. The second checkpoint, because of course there was a second checkpoint, and a third too, because in the name of stereotypical paranoia each ordo had to have their own, went much the same. except with less professional paranoia and more psalm-sighing about bringing holy fire to the treasonous. The Sisters of Battle guarding the Hereticus checkpoint didn't even make an effort to bring out any scanning gear, accepting the mere presence of the Hereticus interrogator as good enough. We collectively sneered behind our visors at them, though Nubby's accompanying rude gesture earned him a fist to the back of the helmet from Amy. The third checkpoint didn't take any shit, because the third checkpoint was a pair of Deathwatch Space Marines. At the third and final door between our convoy and the Grand Inquisitorium, our interrogators were informed in no uncertain terms that they wouldn't be going any further. The elderly curatoress sneered cheerfully at them, informing the three that courtrooms were for adults only, only to find a massive ceramite hand on her bony shoulder and a basso voice informing her that she, her evidence cart, and the unconscious psyker weren't going in either. The ensuing argument was very short and completely one-sided. One of the Deathwatch Marines simply picking up the loudly protesting old woman by the back of her rose with one hand, grabbing fumbles off Doc's back with the other, and barking at the interrogators to get the cart and turn the Dan Untouchables limiter back on. As the one Deathwatch Marine left with his escortees, the second gave the rest of us a once-over with his helmet sensors. We passed inspection without comment, though the Marine did spend a rather long time looking at Tink's weapon, and insisted on triple-checking Nubby's gene scan. At no point did the Space Marine notice the small, invisible Tau drone hovering just overhead, which was sort of worrying given the guy's occupation, and Spot was quietly left to cover our rear as we were waved forwards. Giving Tact a solemn nod and us a vague gesture and grunt towards the boxes, the Codex-approved signal for "get your shit together," the Space Marines turned to the massive blast door behind him and opened it. Like, with his hands, grabbing the big ornate wheel set in its center, and twisting it with the entire force of his power-armored frame, until the massive thing cracked open wide enough for us to get through. Silently giving props to whichever paranoid bastard decided their final security measure should just be a really, really heavy door, we carefully squeezed around the straining Marine and practically ran into the subsector's Deathwatch captain. The towering black-clad Space Marine standing way too close to the opening doorway wasn't wearing a name tag saying, "Watch Captain insert name here" or anything, but our honed inquisitorial instincts left us with little doubt as to his rank. It wasn't just one thing. There was the ornate armor, the fancy power sword, and the weird metal disc thingies that Space Marines hammer into their skulls instead of just using rank insignias like normal people. Mostly though, it was that, in the time-honored traditions of senior officers across the Imperium, the Fratquit wasn't wearing his damn helmet. This did absolutely nothing to diminish the sheer menacing force of his glare as he greeted Administrator Tact. Tact actually flinched, though it took our years serving with him as our adept to notice the slight movement. Responding with all the charm and grace we most definitely lacked, the Administrator went into damage control, assuring the angry Marine that this would definitely be the last delay. Sarge, immediately deciding this was some textbook officer business, marshalled everyone into an orderly parade, carrying the 3 boxes between us in pairs. Behind us, the cracked door slammed back shut, accompanied by the unpleasantly warpy sensation of a ship-grade voice shield activating. The Administrator relaxed slightly as the door closed, and tactfully, how else, segued the conversation onto the subject of just how much longer Oak's trial would last. Whether there really was an Administrative Auxiliary Administration, Analyticate Analysis arm, there was, and if they'd really predicted that the evidence boxes we were carrying would resolve Oak's case within 9 hours, they had, but not in their official reports, the Deathwatch captain obviously believed Tact knew what he was talking about. The angry Marine's entire demeanor changed, his frustration replaced by slightly comical excitement for a brief moment, before hardening into seriousness. Eyeing the boxes, and us by extension, with far more scrutiny than we were comfortable with, the Deathwatch captain leaned down and quietly, for a Space Marine, asked Tact if he thought Oak would invoke the right of counter-accusation. The Administrator, in the lecturing tone we'd all grown far too familiar with during briefings, pointed out that while the right had been invoked in only 9% of intra-inquisitorial trials, the other 91 consisted entirely of those inquisitors tried either in absentia or posthumously. The Space Marine looked a little sheepish as he stood back up and began checking his war gear. Amy's snide remark over the Vox about remembering to check his helmet was cut off in an abrupt "eep" as the captain casually checked the drawer of his power sword directly over her head. Snapping at both Amy and the Deathwatch captain to behave themselves, Administrator Tact strode up to the ornately carved dolomite of the Grand Inquisitorium's service entrance and poked the admission rune. Inquisitor Quercus, known as Oak to everyone without a rod up their ass, including himself once he'd gotten over his own fundamental rigidity, sat on the brilliantly illuminated central platform of the Grand Interrogatorium. Tiered platforms loomed around him, their blur fills obscuring Oak's view of his inquisitorial peers, but the glaring Gothic frescoes of the 127th Centennial Architectural Budget Committee decorating the ceiling made a decent substitute. Under their disapproving gazes, Oak breathed deeply and evenly and thanked the Emperor for the restraint chair he'd been chained into, because he'd probably have passed out if he had to stand on his own right then. It wasn't the whole trial and potential execution that had Oak on edge. That had been part of the plan since pretty much the beginning. He needed demon bait, and here he was, acting out this farce in a desperate attempt to lure the damn thing somewhere even it couldn't escape. He had walked into this knowing all that. The terrifying part was all the stuff he hadn't known about, at least not until Administrator Tact walked into the room and said the code phrase. Oak shuddered as the precise cadences of Administrator Tact's greeting to the Lord Inquisitor triggered the augmentic data array hidden in somewhere in the lower middle-ish of his brain. Centuries' worth of self-deception and comforting lies were burned away by a rampaging tide of suppressed memories. For the first time in almost a century, Inquisitor Oak had all the facts. He understood the plan, he knew why he'd let himself walk into such an obvious trap, and what he needed to do next. And then came the appalling realization that he really had been dumb enough to sell a Necron ship to a rogue trader, at least by proxy. And then he covered it all up to hide his embezzlement of an actual tesseract labyrinth. The one thing he didn't understand was why said proxy was standing here in the courtroom holding said tesseract. Oak just could not fathom why Tact had brought his most disaster-prone subordinates to this critical juncture, especially given the promises he'd given to Lady General von Huppending about her daughter's personal safety. The heiress in question was boggling at the assembled inquisitors like a tourist, while casually waving around a fracking Tau Pos rifle and chatting with what appeared to be the Imperium's only rattling stormtrooper. The fact they were literally carrying the evidence of both their own and Oak's crimes was just the ironic cherry on top of this load of horseshit. Oak shuddered at the thought of what would happen if even one of the Psyker Inquisitors in the audience so much as looked at them, much less if the Lord Inquisitor himself started asking questions. So, with that in mind, he decided it was time to move things along. Nudging the restraint chair's testify room with his chin, Inquisitor Oak cleared his throat, said a silent prayer to the Emperor, and launched straight into the formal wording of the right of counter-accusation. So, no shit, there we were. The proverbial flies on the wall of the Trial of Inquisitor Oak. In a lot of ways, it was a Guardsman's dream come true, watching our rear echelon SO getting raked over the coals for all his bullshit. That's not to say we didn't silently support Oak with every ounce of self-preservation in our beings, but it sure was fun watching him squirm. Unfortunately, watching was definitely the word, because for some reason the fancy pants insisted on doing the whole damn thing in bloody high Gothic. Amy, as the only one of us who spoke the fully excused for a language, was nominated as translator, but even her knobby knobbishness had trouble passing high Gothic legalese. Quickly growing bored with the markswoman's umming and erring, the rest of us surveyed the potential battlefield like good little guardsmen. The courtroom was a sort of massive amphitheatral, with the tiered seats split into raised platforms connected to a perimeter walkway. They had Oak up on a sort of brightly lit stage, strapped into this massive chair thing with room-covered metal bands and the occasional decorative-looking spiky chain. Each of the 4 platforms, one for each Ordo Majoris and one for the Lord Inquisitor and his cronies, was screened off by weird blurry energy fields, as well as way more gothic fretwork than seemed reasonable, tasteful, or even sane. Tink, tilting his head as he looked upwards, pointed out that the blur fields were just there to keep the Inquisitors from seeing each other. The 4 terminally bored Deathwatch Marines standing around the upper perimeter could definitely see over them, which he was pretty sure was intentional. He was less certain about us being able to see up under the field's edges, though, at least until Tax scared the shit out of us by cutting into our comms conversation to explain it was indeed intentional, since this was where he liked to watch from. Taking pity on Amy, the administrator took over translation duties. He kept the explanation short and pithy, but at least didn't bring out the sock puppets, muttering to us over some sort of augmented throat microphone while maintaining his usual bland poker face. According to Tact, Oak's current speech was a legal motion to postpone his trial because some other Inquisitor was a far bigger heretic. Nubby noted that this option hadn't been made available in our trial, but that was probably for the best given the bored expressions we could see under the edges of the blur fields. Tact blandly explained that the official legal challenge had been invoked so often that it had passed into ritual millennia ago, losing all real meaning but none of the length. He assured us that the interesting bit would be at the end, when he added the rarely used, "and they're in this very room with us" part. On cue, the mood in the courtroom abruptly changed. The semi-visible audience sat up attentively, looking around their respective platforms and whispering excitedly to their neighbours, not to mention subtly checking the drawer of their assorted concealed weapons. Behind them, and feeling absolutely no need for subtlety, the 4 Deathwatch Marines readied their own weapons, curtailing most of the fidgeting. Up above us, taking the entire concept of subtlety and declaring it surplus to requirements and to be returned to stores, the Lord Inquisitor rose out of his seat, psychostaff in hand, and instructed the Deathwatch captain behind him to shoot anyone who interrupted. Oak, grinning maniacally, started spilling the beans. All of the beans. Every demonic body-swapping one of them. Now, we'd always been a bit iffy on Oak's inquisitorial credentials, him being a desk-riding, pencil-pushing, rear-echelon unitorum fracker of the highest order, but that was before we watched him run rings around an entire courtroom of Inquisitors while chained to a bloody chair. Without any interruptions, Oak was free to do what he apparently did best, piss off other Inquisitors. Grinning smugly, the man began to air centuries' worth of inquisitorial dirty laundry. Assassinations, cover-ups, demon summonings, and a list of frack-ups so colossal that it dwarfed even ours. Oak laid it all bare for his, ironically, captive audience. Even with us relying on Administrator Tack's glib translation and Amy's reactions, Oak's speech was impressive, as well as oddly familiar. It wasn't just that we'd heard a good portion of it before, drunkenly delivered in an Arbite's laundry break during our one real conversation with our punitive superior officer. Rather, it was something in the delivery and structure of the arguments that reminded us of Sarge's failed diplomacy lessons with Tact, which raised certain questions. The elderly spy turned bureaucrat nodded proudly, assuring us that the little twerp had been even worse than that jackass Skiskatat, if we could believe it, but he'd been a good learner. There was no arguing that Oak had some real charisma. Nubby, as our resident expert on the subject, declared that he had it in spades, hearts, and possibly clubs. Charisma alone wasn't going to get him, or anyone else for that matter, out of an inquisitorial trial, which is why Oak brought something even better. In a move worthy of bloody Castellan Creed himself, our Inquisitor started citing the previously submitted pieces of evidence in his own case, referencing sneakily inserted sections in the generally ignored appendices of several items. Oak wasn't referencing his own evidence, mind you, that'd be too obvious. The scheming bastard had actually managed to doctor the evidence submitted against him. A power move that spoke of mind-boggling levels of foresight, preparation, and deception. At least, that's what the inquisitorial audience, and the Lord Inquisitor in particular, seem to think. Twitch, confidently, and correctly, assured us that Tact and his bureaucratic minions had just done it all for him. Of course, this revelation left Oak in a bit of a pickle, at least according to Tact, because suddenly there were a whole lot of very clever inquisitors flipping through the rest of the notes on their data lecterns, checking to see what else was hidden there. This was presumably why Oak skipped straight to the demon is here, and I want to summon it part, or Daemonum ad testimonium, as he put it, doing a damn good job of projecting righteous fury for a guy locked to a chair. There was a brief silence, and then the inquisitorial audience lost their collective shit. Back in the Guard, we'd have never imagined that there was more than one possible answer to, hey, let's summon a demon, much less 27 separate, utterly self-confident and increasingly shouty ones. It didn't take a genius to see what was coming next, and the Deathwatch Marine ushers seemed to be anticipating the show just as much as we were. At the 9-second mark, the first punch was thrown somewhere up in the Heretica seats, eliciting a round of cheering from the peanut gallery, which abruptly cut off as a wave of psychic silence rolled out from the Lord Inquisitor's staff. These being Inquisitors, it took a little more than a psychic shushing to restore order, which is why, after the third psychic blast, the Deathwatch captain ordered his marines in to break things up. Amazingly, this wasn't the end of things, and after a seventh psychic blast, the Lord Inquisitor angrily turned to the room's control servitor and ordered it to deactivate the blur fields and bring on the seat lights. Realizing they were on display to the other Ordos, most of the Inquisitors froze mid-disagreement, leaving a pair of elderly Hereticus Inquisitors throwing insults and decorative items at each other around a interposed Deathwatch Marine, and an especially vocal Ordos Xenos Inquisitor suspended from the fist of his platform's Marine. The Ordo Malleus platform did not need any help from its assigned Deathwatch Marine, because the Ordo Malleus platform contained only 2 Inquisitors, with the rest of the space being taken up by 4 grey armoured Space Marines and a large reliquary. Some sharp words from the Lord Inquisitor put an end to the scuffle, and after 2 more psychic blasts, the suspended Xenos Inquisitor finally ended his rant with a resounding "Tauda lenda est!" and demanded to be placed back down. Order finally restored, the Lord Inquisitor gave Oak a long, exasperated look, before his curiosity got the better of him, and he asked Oak how he intended to do it. Next to us, Tact quietly chuckled, assuring us all that Oak had this because, as he put it, if there is one thing that boy is good at, is convincing supposedly rational and intelligent people to do something monumentally stupid. Tact was right, as usual. In a surprisingly short time, the Lord Inquisitor had Oak explaining his summoning procedure in plain, old-fashioned Gothic, or as close as one can get while talking about induced xanthistic autoseances and nominative materialism. They even let him out of the chair, which is to say, the Lord Inquisitor and the 2 Ordo Malleus Inquisitors decided to let him out, the rest of the audience not being invited to either vote or comment. This did not sit well with several of the other Inquisitors, but since they didn't have a psychic staff of silence, or their own cadre of Space Marines, their opinions didn't carry any real weight. The straps and chains having been remotely released, Oak was free to pace around the platform, stretching his limbs, and triumphantly monologuing about his brilliant plan to foil what he believed to be a greater demon of Tzeentch. At the Lord Inquisitor's instruction, we were waved forward to lug the 3 boxes over to the stage, passing them through the briefly lowered energy field that constituted the real security here. The second that the boxes were through and the field was back up, Oak's demeanour changed. It wasn't a big change, just a relaxation in the poker face he was maintaining, but we weren't the only ones to notice it. A murmur passed through the audience as the Inquisitors quietly asked each other what was so important about the 3 belatedly delivered evidence boxes, but before the Lord Inquisitor could shush them, Oak announced he was ready to summon the demon right now. Oak's announcement was a surprise, us being under the perfectly reasonable impression that summoning a demon took a bit more setup and effort. We'd expected a bunch of runes and geometric lines drawn in blood, or at least red chalk and maybe some ritual chanting and a bunch of dribbly candles. At the very least, we'd expected a psyker, Oak not being one despite rumours to the contrary. And we certainly weren't alone in that assumption, judging by the shocked expressions on several of the Inquisitors' faces. The Lord Inquisitor, realising that he'd lost all control over the situation and looking none too happy about it, grumpily ordered Oak to get on with it. There was at least a little bit of ritual involved, if only in the sense that Oak had obviously spent way too much time practicing his speech in the shower. Monologuing in his best orator voice, Oak strolled around the boxes, reintroducing the 3 dead Inquisitors whose skulls he'd acquired, and who he'd just previously accused of demonic possession, much to the scandalization of the audience. Some of the Inquisitors were more than scandalized, though. There was a definite undercurrent of, by the Emperor, this might actually work. Especially from the 2 Malleus Inquisitors and their squad of grey-armoured Space Marines. Playing his audience like a marketplace charlatan, Oak advised that everyone, not just the Space Marines, get their weapons ready and place their bets on which of their colleagues it was going to be. The Lord Inquisitor bellowed at him to stop showing off and just do it, and Oak pushed the little hidden button on the first box's latch. Inside the masterfully crafted facsimile of an inquisitorial evidence box, a tiny Vox transmitter verified the presence and readiness of its sibling units, and then activated the Xeno-Spiritual Warp Battery. The Warp Battery, consisting of a delicate wafer of intricately worked wraithbone, an Eldar soul gem, and a small shaped explosive charge, flooded with psychic energy as the soul gem was shattered. The soul of the Eldar Bonesinger occupying the gem was understandably distressed at its predicament, and fled outwards through the wraithbone circuitry towards the one minuscule sliver of hope left to it, the oddly green chips of soulstone embedded in the skull latch's eyes. Psychic energy poured into the skull of the long-dead Inquisitor, branching through the delicately carved Fenrisian runes covering its interior. The spell had been hand-carved, literally, like with his fingernails, by an ex-Deathwatch rune priest of Oak's personal acquaintance in exchange for a veritable trove of Space Wolf war gear recovered from a renegade Bloodraven strike cruiser during the Aurelian Purge. Essentially, it was an old Fenrisian spell, used for millennia by both the Vengeful and the Boastful to summon the shade of the slain to name the one who slew them. Where it got interesting was what happened when the answer was, "Well, technically, it was that Inquisitor over there on that box next to me." From the outside, there wasn't much to see. First one chest started glowing with eldritch energy, then the one next to it, and then a third. This was followed by an awkwardly long wait, with Oak glaring daggers at the glowing boxes, and making a just a few more seconds gesture. Then, as the audience started getting angsty, and the first calls for Oak's execution began to ring out, a small, dumpy Inquisitor in the Order Xenos section erupted in pink feathers. The situation was evolving quickly, quite literally, in the case of the patently possessed Pink Inquisitor, whose colourful feathers were followed by the abrupt elongation of their everything. The humanoid form stretched upwards into something massive and avian, his hair splitting apart into 2 writhing necks and wings sprouting from his back, almost faster than the eye could see. Of course, almost didn't really cut it, where either Space Marines or Inquisitors were concerned, or us for that matter. A torrent of bolter, las, melter, plasma, and totally not pulse rifle fire slammed into the emerging demon, reducing its corporeal form to an iridescent pink mist, along with 3 adjacent Inquisitors and a decent portion of the platform. Even that wasn't enough, though. Showing a resilience that dwarfed even the demon throp, the aerosolized demons started persistently reforming around the incoming projectiles. The brief stalemate ended as the Order's Malleus came into play, the 2 Inquisitors chanting some unintelligible litany and waving their staffs, while the 4 Space Marines in the ornate grey armour jumped the considerable gap between the platforms and activated their force weapons. As the Space Marines closed on the thing, the diffuse cloud of projectile-ridden demon stuff attempted to shy away, but an invisible force held it pinned. Actually, the force had it more than pinned. It was inexorably dragging the thing forwards, onto the blades of the Psyker Astartes, and then even further towards the centre stage. Oak watched triumphantly as minced demonic matter flowed through the energy field protecting him, and poured down into the open mouth of the first box. The flow grew to a torrent as the Marines started chopping away bigger and bigger chunks, and then, very abruptly, it was over. The last remnants of the Daemon, losing all cohesion, was sucked into the box with a distinctly slurp-like sound. The lid closed with an impressive slam, followed almost instantaneously by two more, as the first box was drawn into the second, and then into the third like one of those Vostralian nesting dolls. The solitary remaining chest sat still and pulsed with a steady, barely pink psychic glow. Oak, having prudently taken cover behind the restraint chair as the torrent of demon stuff poured in, stepped out and surveyed the situation with an air of smug satisfaction. Then, I shit you not, everyone started clapping. The two Malleus Inquisitors were the ones who started it, but the attitude was downright infectious, and claps and cheers started ringing out from all sides, with even one of the Deathwatch Marines joining in. Oak, unable to resist being an overdramatic prat, stood there in the middle of the stage and started bowing to the crowd like a bloody stage magician after an exceptionally clever trick. Credit where it was due, it had been a greater demon of Tzeentch he poured out of an audience member's ear, and even we were clapping and cheering. But then again, we were idiots, not a bunch of fracking inquisitors, and Oak had even less of an excuse than all of them, since he still had a job to do. Several of them, in fact, starting with the final step of his demon-capturing plan: activating the fracking tesseract. Unfortunately, in so many ways, before Oak could finish his grandstanding and get around to doing his damn job, the Order's Malleus decided to do it for him. Declaring time to be of the essence, one of the Malleus Inquisitors jumped down to the floor, directing his grey Psychomarines minions to bring forward a massive, ornately decorated reliquary. The other Malleus Inquisitor requested that the Lord Inquisitor lower the energy field so the knights could perform their rite of sealing, and that Oak please back away. We'd never seen Inquisitor Oak dither before, but it was definitely happening now. As Tact explained it, Oak had a simple choice. He could insist his demon trap was good enough, admitting in the process that he'd misappropriated a tesseract labyrinth, figured out how to make it work and smuggled it into inquisitorial headquarters. Or he could sprint for the box, hit the button, and try to come up with a believable explanation on the spot, under the scrutiny of a bunch of psychers, and an audience still full of traitors. Or he could, keep his mouth shut and just let the Ordo Malleus have the damn thing, without revealing anything self-incriminating at all. Needless to say, he chose the latter. The consequences of Oak's weaseliness became apparent, as the Grey Knights finished their ritual, and a flash of green light, which even we could recognise as necrony, sucked the whole box into the reliquary. The Malleus Inquisitor, looking very pleased with himself, announced that they had a long trip to Titan, and needed to get going before the Tyrannid Splinter Fleet got any closer. Up on their platform, the sole remaining Malleus Inquisitor assured him that she'd handle the rest of the trial, and he really should get going immediately. Oak, whose plan involved keeping the demon locked in the courtroom until his evidence had been fully heard and a plan of action had been formed, abruptly shifted into damage control mode. He was already too late. Oak did his best to stop the Grey Knights leaving with the box, arguing that it would tip off the conspiracy, and that the Tyrannids weren't that imminent a threat. When that didn't work, he switched to trying to convince the court into immediate action, initiating a full purge of inquisitorial headquarters alongside the Knights' exit. Unfortunately, this led to the questions of targets, priorities, who could be trusted, and whether Oak really expected them to just take his word on it, instead of looking at the evidence themselves. Rather desperately, Oak shifted from asking for a purge to merely requesting a lockdown of the whole facility by trustworthy non-inquisitorial forces, such as the Mustering Guard Task Force in orbit. The Lord Inquisitor asked if he meant the Guard Task Force commanded by the same Lady General von Huppending, whose daughter Oak held hostage. Ignoring the outraged sputtering from both the audience and Amy, Oak soldiered on, insisting that Emilia von Huppending had actually been apprehended by the Inquisition, along with the majority of his teams. The Lord Inquisitor paused, visibly pondering whether he'd accidentally executed the daughter of the system's de facto military commander, before tact cleared his throat. More surprised than offended, as if a chair or desk had suddenly offered his expert opinion on the matter at hand, the Lord Inquisitor nodded to Administrator Tact. Playing the pedantic bureaucrat with every ounce of his being, Tact explained that the heiress in question had received a commuted sentence, merely having been transferred to the Inquisitorial Penal Legion, the one which had just shipped out to serve as Tyranid fodder. This time it wasn't just the Lord Inquisitor who paused. The entire audience was taking a moment to ponder the options for indiscriminate retribution available to a vengeful Lady General. Tact let the moment drag out, just in case Oak wanted to explain why the situation really wasn't as bad as it sounded. Oak, sporting the look of a man who had absolutely no intention of admitting he managed to fake a whole Tyranid incursion, kept his mouth shut. With a curse only we could hear, Tact blithely continued, assuring the Lord Inquisitor that it had all been taken care of, the young lady having been picked up shortly after deployment by their mutual cousin. The Lord Inquisitor stared back blankly, until Tact added, "You know, large moustache, has a psycho butler, insists everyone call him the Rupert." Nodding in sudden recognition, the Lord Inquisitor turned back to Oak and informed him that the answer was still no. The same went for the rest of Oak's suggestions. No to the Lamenter Space Marines, who he'd gifted a large cache of Genesies captured from a Alphamarine recruitment base. No to the Mechanicus Scutari, who were here to pick up the heretic he'd been hiding. Again. And no to the several ships full of Arbites, sent here in force on the orders of his protege, Inquisitor Skiskatat. Even his final suggestion, having the local Deathwatch contingent handle it all themselves, was shot down, though that last one had more to do with the Deathwatch captain wanting no part of the shit show and suggesting an orbital bombardment instead. Thoroughly outfoxed and desperately trying not to look like it, Inquisitor Oak watched the squad of Grey Knights as they hefted their reliquary and headed for the service door. The Lord Inquisitor returned to his seat, ordering Tact, which is to say us, to clean up the worst of the mess. As we got the scattered mess of evidence boxes back into their assigned spots, what was left of the inquisitorial audience tried to find seats without too much blood and or bullet holes and sat back down. Oak reluctantly got back into his seat too, shooting the occasional glance from Tact, to us, to the door the Space Marines had gone through, back to Tact, and so on. Doing his best to ignore the blatant signalling, the Administrator diffidently pointed out that the Lord Inquisitor had quite a bit on his schedule, and asked if he should discreetly postpone things until their deliberations were finished. After a thoughtful pause, the Lord Inquisitor nodded, and sent him off to handle things in his absence, adding a casual instruction to take his escort along and have us mind-wiped and assigned to Malleus service. As the service door shut behind us, Tat let out a long, frustrated breath, declared Oak to be a self-serving little shitweasel, and yelled at us to get moving before those Malleus frackwits screwed everything up. The change in mood was sudden, but unsurprising. Even if we didn't know exactly how or why, we always expected someone to frack up. It was one of the tenets of Murphus. So, as proper Guardsmen, we were preparing for shit to hit the fan before we even stepped off the shuttle. We double-timed it to the exit, Tatch jogging along at the rear, only to slow down as the voice shield loomed. The elderly administrator elbowed past us to a small control lectern, cursing under his breath the entire time. Sarge rather curtly told the man to stop bitching and start briefing. Tat gave him a withering look and explained that we just entrusted a greater demon of Tzeentch to a bunch of psychers for transport. The chances of them fracking this all up were beyond certain. On cue, he deactivated the void shield, revealing a massive jagged hole where that vault door had been. The Deathwatch Marines who'd been supermanning the post were notably absent, but at least we found the door. It was slumped against the far wall where the impatient Space Marine psychers had yoked it when nobody had answered their polite knocking. It was impressive as hell. Not the broken door, mind you. Anyone can break a door, but it takes a damn professional to frack up their mission before even making it past the first checkpoint. We would know. Nubby and Doc whistled appreciatively. Amy swore, and Twitch started cackling maniacally. While Tink sent out a ping to Spot 3.0, Sarge grabbed the spy, formerly known as Diplomacy Adept, by the back of his robe and broke into a sprint. Rather embarrassingly, Sarge had to immediately stop and turn around, so Tat could turn the voice shield back on. It was definitely worth a short backtrack though, since judging by the muffled shouting and bolter fire, the Inquisitors were busy with their deliberations and wouldn't want any interruptions. Tat took a break from cursing Oak's name to proudly declare that between the enemy's stacking of the court and his own gracious assistance with their efforts, nearly a third of the Inquisitors still in there were conspiracy agents, hence the Space Marine ushers. Unfortunately, the same ratio held true for the giant mob of inquisitorial agents the Grey Knights were about to march out into with their demon box. As Guardsmen, we generally approved of the good old get all your enemies in one place and then shoot them maneuver, but thinking back to that small army of inquisitorial minions we passed through on the way in, Oak and Tact had definitely overdone it. There was also the rather pressing question of why in the Emperor's name neither one of them had told anyone at all, about their genius master plan to invite all their enemies here at once. That, Tact informed us, had been Oak's job, hence the preemptive pardon and the Archaeotech energy shield protecting him from the audience, and the inquisitorial fracking rosette he was so fracking proud of. But no, instead of coming clean and taking his lumps, he chickened out and now we were stuck cleaning up his mess, all because that slimy little weasel wanted to keep his fracking job. Sarge nodded as he picked Tack back up and asked why he hadn't said anything. "And blown my cover? Frack off!" Tink interrupted Tack's tirade to inform us that Spot should have seen what had happened to the Deathwatch Marines, and he was pulling the vid now. Tink's run slowed to a jog, then a walk, as he poked at his dataslate with increasing annoyance. Finally, the techie shrugged and clarified that he actually had no idea what happened to the Deathwatch Marines, since the first one never came back, and the other just sort of stepped into a shadow and vanished. Just poof, gone. Tink asked if that was, like, a Deathwatch thing, only for Tat to snap that no, it wasn't, because that was an Alphamarine infiltrator. The Administrator's bombshell didn't hit quite how he expected. Nubby asked if he meant, like, one of them baby marines with the fancy stealth cloaks and sniper rifles. Only for Amy to point out that this one had power armor and a bolter, and it wasn't even a stalker pattern. Tat told both of them to shut up, looked around at the rest of us in bafflement, before slowly explaining that an Alphamarine was a Chaos Space Marine. We'd, killed one, remember? There was a thoughtful pause, and then Sarge asked if he meant the pointy blue-green one, or the spiky black-yellow ones. And more importantly, did he mean infiltrator in the tactical sense, or... Twitch answered before Tact, explaining that, just like Orc commandos, the greenish Chaos Marines could disguise themselves as Deathwatch Marines, lying in wait with nobody the wiser until it was time to strike. Tact stared blankly for a second, started to say something, and then sighed and admitted that Twitch was pretty much right. With a triumphant shout of, "I knew it!" the Demolitions Trooper started pulling crack nades from his pack and handing them out. The point which we were so aggressively missing was that the Grey Knights and their chump of a boss were walking straight into not one, but two ambushes. On the bright side, though, it looked like they weren't completely clueless, since according to the note pinned to the passageway's middle door, they'd commandeered the entire band of sisters guarding it. Tact paused for a second to boggle at the note, which declared that the sisters were escorting a squad of Grey Knights and their containment reliquary to their shuttle back in 30, and asked if one of us had written it. Sarge pointed out that we'd have just called the thing a demon box, and the spelling was too good, and then picked the grumpy old man back up before he could start complaining about youth these days, and their lack of operational security. Someone else was taking OPSEC seriously though, because there was something wrong with our comms. Well, not our comms, as Tink immediately pointed out. It was Tact who said he was having a problem reaching anyone, except for us, of course. Tink, not having any idea how to mess with Tak's internal spyfox thing, started flipping his own combi through channels, and slowed to a walk while he poked at his data slate. Everyone turned to look at the techie as he triumphantly announced that our comms were all fine. It was the headquarters network that was fracked to hell. It wasn't down exactly, and it hadn't locked us out. It just didn't seem to be passing along any of our messages. There was definitely other traffic though. A lot of it. Belatedly recognizing the looks of horror on Sarge, Doc, and Tak's faces, Tink announced it was probably time to give Jim and Hannah a call. Engine Seer Jimothy flinched in embarrassment as the blare of a Tau military-grade Fox signal, tuned to max anti-jamming no less, cut through the data cant of the choir. Jim's sense of shame was a tired, vestigial thing, though, worn down by life, Guardsmen, demonic incursions, Guardsmen, and his unasked-for credentials as a cadet member of the Order's Juris. Hannah's, on the other mechadendrite, was non-existent. Before Jim could say anything, or she'd even decrypted the signal, the NGCRS ranted on the assembled senior tech priests and unleashed a verbal reaming that would have done Inquisitor Sergeant proud. When he'd first arrived, the local priesthood had been surprisingly cooperative. This had less to do with any personal respect for the two low-level Order's Juris acolytes, and more to do with the creepily smiling hologram of the Magos Juris currently commanding the fleet in orbit. That and the cadre of combat engineers that constituted the delegation from the Palladian 257th. The revelation that Oak's contact was the same Magos Juris that had inducted Jim and Hannah wasn't a surprise exactly, since Jim and Hannah had both been firmly praying to the Omnissiah that this was the case ever since they'd seen the familiar Ark at the centre of the Mechanicus fleet. The combat engineers were a surprise though, and Jim let out a panicked blurt of binary as the heavily armed tech priests and their even more heavily armed servitors trooped out en masse in response to his signal at Vehicle Bay I-9's service entrance. Even more surprising than their over-armed escort was the presence of a worryingly familiar-looking oversized servo skull accompanying them. Hannah sent a panic signal to Theo, who reassured her that the Mago was definitely still aboard and currently pontificating on the difference between a Mork host and a Gork host. The servo skull also reassured her that any resemblance to heretics living or dead was purely coincidental, and it was merely a well-disguised Archaeotech data relay of staggering bandwidth and fidelity. This did not reassure either Hannah or Jim, which, given the Magos Juris in question, was presumably the point. Backed up by their Magos' authorization codes, Jim and Hannah had no problem walking straight into the facility's primary data node, and announcing an immediate security audit. In fact, several of the resident tech priests seemed downright giddy at the prospect, which made sense after Jim saw what centuries of credential management via inquisitorial fiat had done to the security system's machine spirit. Hannah took one look at the opaque, twisted mass of a machine spirit and declared it to be exactly the sort of security system that Occurrence Border would have. If it had one at all, that is. The tech priests, summoned in from the inquisitorial retinues, were less cooperative. For the most part, they grudgingly submitted to the Magos Juris' authorization codes, albeit with a lot of nigh heretical complaining. The 6 tech priests who refused to recognize Jim, Hannah, or the telepresent Magos as legitimate representatives of the Ordo Juris, or the Ordo Juris as legitimate itself, were informed that their objections were noted, before being forcibly subdued and integrated into the data choir by a bunch of unamused combat engineers. The other 3 objectors had expressed their opinion via a barrage of warp-infused scrap code, which would have been very effective if standard engineer protocol, in both the Guard and on the Occurrence Border, didn't include turning off all Noospheric and Vox data connections. Once the crater where the 3 heretics had been standing stopped smoking, the conclave of disaster recovery commenced. They had been 2 hours into the litany of safe shutdown, with 7 still to go, when Tink's signal brought an end to the farce. Hannah's rant was interrupted by the Magos Juris, redirecting full control of the assembled data choir to her. There was a brief pause as the NGCRS attempted to pass the sudden deluge of data, and then she found what she was looking for. The assembled tech priesthood swore and held onto their augmented butts, as Hannah ordered the entire power distribution system into full emergency purge and shutdown, without incense. Tink swore and stumbled as Jim's transmission came in, and informed everyone present that the entire, everything was going to be experiencing technical difficulties shortly. Sarge swore and dropped to the rear next to Nubby, and readied the administrator for detachment. With Twitch and Amy on point, we jogged through the door into the Hollow Hall, just in time to see Mr. Professional Demon Wrangler Malleus Inquisitor Badass explode. Well, not actually see. What with all the Malleus stormtroopers and space marines between us and the blast, which was actually more of a wet pop. Spot had a great view, though, and caught a nice clear pic of the Inquisitor going off like a balloon full of viscera, pink fire, and demons. Why exactly this happened was unclear, but even Malleus Inquisitors, who are famously prone to this sort of thing, don't just randomly explode. Our money was on the little scroll he'd just been handed by that Auto-Xenos interrogator, that and his own untouchable interrogator deactivating his limiter with a triumphant cackle. The traitorous untouchable had roughly half a second to revel in his betrayal before the blast wave of flaming Inquisitor bits slapped the smug look off his face. The Xenos interrogator did better, ducking behind his companion and merely catching an artistic splash of pink fire across his forehead. The 4 Space Marines, on the other hand, didn't even try to dodge, stomping forward through the wave of liquid fire and slicing the newly manifested demon, a sort of living fire thing, to shreds with their force weapons. As badass as the Space Marines' immediate counterattack was, the short-lived fire demon had already done its job. The iridescent flames clinging to the 4 Marines erupted like flares as they attacked with their psychic weapons, and the Xenos interrogator cackled triumphantly as he unleashed a psychic shriek that signaled the start of the ambush. The ambush, the first one at least, was both well planned and professionally executed. All across the massive hollow hall, traitorous Inquisition agents leapt into violent action, and not just against the Space Marines. Every single retinue seemed to have been infiltrated in one way or another, and it didn't take much for the embedded conspiracy agents to goad their comrades' paranoia and grudges into fratricidal violence. Entire retinues opened fire on each other, psychic attacks of every sort were unleashed, and combat servitors and cyber masters were unleashed, more literally. In a frenzy of betrayal, violence, and stupidly worthy of an Orc diplomatic summit, the entire place devolved into utter chaos. Under the cover of the massive bloodbath, the conspiracy's heavies made their move on the Space Marines, and the critical flaw in their plan became apparent. You see, instead of exploding the entire damn convoy with, say, Twitch's bodyweight in good old-fashioned high explosives, they decided to get fancy. So instead of having their smoking remains scattered across a half-kilometre radius, the 4 psychic Space Marines had merely been doused with Inquisitor-flavoured warp fire. It was admittedly a very fancy variety of warp fire, one that fed off the Grey Knight's own psychic powers, at least judging by the way one of the Marines erupted like a bonfire, as he threw up a massive psychic shield over their position. A conventionally exploded psychic Space Marine would not have been able to project such a shield though, and the conspiracy's opening barrage of psychic attacks and exotic ranged weaponry would have actually done something, assuming it would have been necessary at all. Just saying. At this point, Administrator Tact cut in to ask if we were going to do anything. In unison, every single red-blooded, emperor-fearing, heresy-not-committing one of us rounded on the little shit with a unanimous whisper of expletive no. As if to punctuate the point, a massive power surge radiated through the, well, everything. Vox systems shorted in showers of sparks. The massive door jamb we were all heroically hiding behind made an ominous clunking sound, and every single light in the room went out. Nubby gestured at the massive cavern, illuminated only by the flickering hollow statues and the sheer mass of weapons fire, and invited the former diplomacy adept to show us how it's done. The man had a point though. We really did need to do something, and just as soon as we figured out what in the Emperor's name that was, we would get around to it. Amy was looking between her pulse rifle scope and Spot's video feed, trying to figure out if she could land hits on the rapidly moving targets, and whether Spot's marker thingy would help enough for the rest of us to assist. Twitch argued that this was a waste of time and effort, and that we should just go with the tried and true blow spot up again plan, on the theory that the Space Marine psychic sure thing would probably be enough to handle a medium-sized explosion. Sarge was keeping his attention focused entirely on the box, while debating with Doc whether or not the Xenos interrogator was a demon host. Not that there was much to debate, what with him holding up in melee combat with 3 Space Marines. That and the feathers and tentacles. Nubby, for his part, spent several enjoyable seconds pointing out the most interesting features of the ambush. There was the jetpack-wearing rattling zooming around the hollow statues, the Ogren Preacher with a heavy flamer, completely forgetting the words to a battle hymn but doing a good job on the tune, and the missing Sororitas contingent being torn apart by 3 Dreadnought light war machines. With the lights out, there wasn't much to see though, so the little trooper keyed his combead to see how Fumbles was doing. Fumble's relieved answer was cut off by a yelp of pain, and the curatoress angrily demanding to know where Tact was, and why he wasn't answering his comms. The elderly spy turned administrator Tshirt at his henchwoman's voice, and immediately started exchanging a barrage of gibberish with her. The incomprehensible conversation went on for several seconds, all of us wisely keeping our mouths shut, until Tact abruptly cut off and turned to Tink, before unleashing an equally unintelligible barrage of technobabble. Over the course of the next few seconds, dozens of separate, wildly incompatible inquisitorial comms networks were patched into Spot's net. As Tink made the final connection and Spot whined in mechanical protest, the elderly spy administrator began speaking in an entirely different voice, one we all recognized from the trial. In the booming voice of the Lord Inquisitor, Tact ordered all listening agents to engage Omega Protocol, and then immediately closed the channel, and told Tink to turn all the networks off and start jamming before anyone could ask any questions or issue any orders of their own. We weren't sure what an Omega Protocol was, but a sort of order seemed to be coalescing out of the maelstrom. Several groups of inquisitorial agents began breaking off and running for the various exits in a coordinated fashion, while others moved in around the fringes of the main battle. The Space Marines were holding their own against the daemonic interrogator and several of his allies, while their stormtrooper escort was having significantly less success. They were trying their best, but even before the conspiracy agents closed to melee, they'd been having a bit of trouble with their own untouchable interrogator. 2 of the slower stormtroopers had tried to help the interrogator, slapping at the living flames that covered him, only to reel backwards as the pink fire clung to them. They were still screaming about their twisting and mutating flesh when their comrades opened fire on all 3 of them, a barrage of hellgun rounds putting down the 2 mutating troopers, but doing nothing to the living bonfire that was the interrogator. Completely ignoring the lad's fire, the untouchable interrogator arrived around, casting little droplets of flaming interrogator tallow that brought down 2 other stormtroopers before a burst of bolter shells finally tore them to pieces. While this did solve the immediate problem, it went rather poorly for the nearest 5 or 6 stormtroopers, and forced the survivors away from the steadily growing lake of mutagenic fire. Now it was just the 3 Space Marines, unless you count the 4th one fully engaged in warp fire, against the demonic interrogator, with about half of the ambush force to back him up. At once, the surviving heretics fell on the Space Marines, as their demonic leader vanished in a puff of smoke, only to reappear several seconds later behind the Space Marines, standing over the box. Sarge swore, ordering the rest of us to get ready, as he watched the demonic interrogator on Tink's data slate. The demonic interrogator plunged a clawed finger into the burning rune on his forehead, quickly withdrawing it and drawing a matching rune on the adamantium surface of the reliquary. With a triumphant shriek from the beak-like beak thing, he leapt backwards, and in a piercing cry that radiated through our very souls, screeched, "He comes!" For a split second, the fighting stopped, everyone's attention on the interrogator as he stood, wings spread over the box. And absolutely nothing happened. The interrogator let out a little squawk of dismay, as 3 different storm bolters blasted him to pieces, which evaporated out of the air. Tact looked to the rest of us and commented that, though Magos Smith was certainly insane, he did excellent work. Rather than break at the death of their leader, the conspiracy agents redoubled their assault, bringing down another of the Marines and forcing the remaining two back to back over the box. It was at this point, as the Grey Knights made their last stand, that the second ambush started. The second ambush was not well planned, because the second ambush did not need to be well planned, because the second ambush consisted of 3 squads of centuries-old, genetically enhanced, power-armoured super warriors, and also a dreadnought. Instead of bothering with subterfuge or misdirection, the 3+ squads of Deathwatch Astartes strode through the room in a wave of indiscriminate violence that warmed our guardsmanly hearts. Bolter shells and more exotic weapons cut down dozens of Inquisition agents of indeterminate allegiance, while other Marines armed with chainsaws or power weapons carved bloody swords through anyone dumb enough not to run for it. Sarge let out a long breath and stood everyone back down, not that we needed telling, and returned to watching the besieged reliquary while Nubby solicited the rest of us to place our bets on how many of them were Alphamarines. The bets were 9, 9, 9, all of them, and somewhere between 8 and 10 with an 11% error margin. Unfortunately for Tact, his bet was rejected on the grounds that it was his fault all of these Marines were here in the first place. The fact that his bet was the same as everyone else's was not seen as a factor. Things being more or less a tie, the real betting was on whether the Dreadnought was an Alphamarine too, or possibly a cleverly disguised Orc war boss, at which point the Curatoress cut in again, saying that she damn well hoped the big guy wasn't an Alphamarine, because it was his giant ceramite ass that was covering their approach. The phrase "covering our approach" needed little explaining. For instance, the covering didn't involve any actual covering fire. In fact, the massive yellow and black war machine didn't appear to have any ranged weapons at all. Just a pair of stubby clawed arms with attached flamers. Instead, the big guy just stomped straight across the room, cutting right through the hectic maelstrom of violence, securing the knowledge that nobody still alive at this point would be dumb enough to get in the way of a fracking dreadnought. Somewhere behind the big stompy war machine, packed tightly into the bubble of invisibility fumbles was straining to keep projected, the Curatoress followed, backed up by the nice young space marine from the door, and his friends from the medbay. Mind you, they didn't have an actual plan either. The Curatoress described their general strategy as get as close as possible before the sudden but inevitable betrayal, then wing it. This was rather embarrassing, since not only was it the exact plan as ours, but they had started it first. Not to be outdone by a bunch of NGPs, non-guard personnel, Sarge gave the order to move out. The Dreadnought and its invisible escort were coming in from our 3 o'clock, which Tact claimed was the tunnel leading to the motorpool, and recommended as our best line of retreat, assuming we managed to grab the box ourselves. There was quite a bit of hollow hall between us and them, but the Deathwatch Marines had done an admirable job of killing everyone too dumb or heretical to follow Tact's orders to withdraw, so it was more or less clear, as long as we stayed away from the scrum over the damn box. Sarge grabbed Tact again, gestured at Nubby to lead the way, and as a unit, we once again began the process of sidling around a complete Charlie Foxtrot that was technically not our problem. Actually, whatever the opposite of technically is. That. Per Sarge's orders, as we moved, Tink kept an eye, or a spot, on the reliquary and the ongoing dispute over its ownership. The 2 Grey Knights, once again not counting the giant pillar of fire, keeping the flickering psychic shield erected, were on their last legs. The conspiracy assault, despite the loss of their leader, comms and lighting, not to mention everything else that had gone catastrophically wrong, was still pushing inwards. It was obviously a matter of moments before the 2 Space Marines fell, and the question of the box's ownership became someone else's, our problem. But as the traitors made their final push, the Deathwatch assault caught up with them. A hail of bolter and plasma fire cut down the last of the conspiracy agents, leaving a single Grey Knight, an arm and half a leg completely encased with warp fire, standing victorious over his charge. At which point, the 3rd ambush kicked off. In a repeat of the conspiracy's grand betrayal, between 8 and 10 Space Marines, with an 11% margin for error, suddenly but inevitably turned on their battle brothers. Nubby was instructed to stop trying to count who was on which side, while Sarge did exactly that, except for far more valid staying alive reasons, and Tact badgered Tink to turn Spot's jamming as high as it would go. The frenzy of Space Marine on Space Marine violence stopped as quickly as it started, leaving 0 surviving Grey Knights, an indeterminate number of Deathwatch / Alphamarines scattered around the darkened room, and one Dreadnought still slowly plodding towards the centre of the room, seemingly oblivious to the bloodbath around it. There were several seconds of silence, punctuated only by the sound of stomping footsteps and the occasional bolter fire, as the hidden Space Marines sniped at each other, and then a deep, frustrated voice declared, "The Inquisitor expects his closet for monsters, but not under his bed." Once again there was a silence, and then another basso voice called out, "The Commissar knows not how to hold a sword, only a whip." A third voice, startlingly close to our position, barked out, "It is Wednesday, my battle brothers," followed by several other shouts of incomprehensible gibberish. In the centre of the room, a lone Deathwatch Marine stepped into the flickering light of the immolated Grey Knight and the still burning, and worryingly twitching, remains of the Untouchable. Removing his helmet, he incredulously asks if they were all Alphamarines. After a brief pause, a second Marine stepped out and proclaimed he killed all of his assigned targets. One by one, a total of 9 Marines entered the light and declared their betrayals while spouting gibberish code phrases at one another. In a quiet voice, Nubby asked, "Who here at 9? 3 Guardsmen and Tact raised their hands. Nubby told Tact to frack off. Then a voice even deeper than the rest rang out. "As am I." The 9 Space Marines spun around, briefly drawing aim on the Dreadnought before registering its lack of ranged weapons. Not even missing a step, it continued. "Even in death, I still serve the ruinous powers." And a green multi-headed dragon sigil flickered into visibility on the War Machine's chest. The helmetless Space Marine looked around in surprise, before shrugging and announcing that it did finally explain why the big guy was here, instead of back with the scythes. Several of the other traitor Marines nodded in agreement, and as a group, moved to encircle the tainted reliquary and started quietly arguing with each other in some incomprehensible private language. Whatever the Alphamarines were arguing about, presumably who was going to have to carry the still mutating reliquary, they didn't have time to reach a decision. There was a sudden pained curse from Fumbles, and the advancing green sigil dreadnought flickered and vanished, revealing a tightly packed squad of Deathwatch Marines and an exhausted Psyker. All 9 Alpha Marines began to turn and bring their weapons to bear, only to realise that the actual dreadnought was just a little bit closer than it had appeared. With a massive, wall-shaking bellow of "Not!", the dreadnought sprinted across the last few meters, and several tons of pissed-off Astartes war machine smashed into the traitor Marines along with a volley of crack grenades. They weren't our grenades. Even Sarge couldn't lob one that far. Our contribution consisted of a barrage of pulse rounds bursting through the hologram of a long-dead Inquisitor in an especially tasteless hat, all focused on a single point as designated by a towish marker light. The target of the barrage, the one jackass who still wasn't wearing his helmet, didn't even have time to react before his oversized skull exploded. Tink's overcharged plasma blast, moving slower than the pole shots, sailed through the empty space where the traitor Marine skull used to be, before continuing on to intercept a leaping conspiracy agent mid-sneak attack. Seizing the opportunity provided by the surprise dreadnought, the remaining traitorous inquisitorial agents launched a final desperate attempt to capture the reliquary. They were mostly ignored, the Alpha Marines opportunistically gunning them down as they dodged around the flaming dreadnought. The exception was the feathered pink form of the interrogator host. While his comrades rushed blindly into their deaths, the demonic interrogator hummed back, arms and other appendages raised in a shrieking chant. Tink immediately shifted Spot's marker light to this new priority target, and our second volley tore into the mutated demon host's head-torso region. That wasn't nearly enough to put the thing down, its flesh flowing back into the gaps like watery pudding, but we sure fracked up whatever spell it had been casting. A storm of pink and blue fire erupted out of the demon host, with all the accuracy and control of an entire crate of bolter shells cooking off at once. The few remaining conspiracy ambushers were sprayed from behind with mutating fire, along with 2 of the Alphamarines, the hollow statue between us, and a generous portion of the combat area. The spell fell far short of most of our allies, Fumbles and the Curatoress's squad of Deathwatch Marines having prudently held back from rushing in. The 2 non-Space Marines were heroically cowering behind an overturned altar to some inquisitorial saint, while the 4 loyal Deathwatch Marines had spread out to cover the Dreadnought's charge. The leader of the small squad, bearing a familiar apothecary kit and comet emblem, bellowed over our comnet for Sergeant Gravis to grab the damn box and get back here before he broke something. Sergeant Gravis did not appear to be listening though, being far too busy flailing at the 3 Alphamarines dancing outside of his reach. And it really was flailing, full of wild blows more appropriate for an Orc warlord than the graceful Space Marine we remembered. Honestly, he was outclassed, and wouldn't have caught any of the 3 if it wasn't for the blast of warp fire raining around them. As one of his 3 targets, a power sword wielding Marine with a red teardrop emblem, dodged away from an incoming fireball. Gravis lunged, snatching the Marine out of midair with a triumphant bellow, and then staggering as a massive foot punched straight through the mass of flesh. Tentacles and flames, the said fireball left on the floor. It had honestly never occurred to us that a Dreadnought even could trip. The multi-ton Astartes war machine smashed forwards in a spray of sparks, blood and warp fire, crushing the unfortunate Alphamarine in his clutches, and putting his one empty claw straight through the mutated metal of the box. This time, instead of a flash of necrotic light, the box released a massive pulse of psychic energy. The warp fire all around erupted upwards, and there was a triumphant screech from the demon host. "He comes! For real this time! The unknowing and unknown! The unseen and unseen! The undoer and the undone! Unknown! The eternally surprised!" There was an awkward pause, as the demon host made a grandiose gesture in Gravis' general direction. And once again, nothing happened. Instead, the rising tide of warp energy abruptly stopped with a sudden psychic clang. There was a pause, and then the demon spoke. "Well, this is certainly unexpected." The voice was horrific. It was like someone had coupled together the screaming of millions of tormented souls into a posh high gothic accent. It was like if the demon frog could talk, was sentient, knew you personally, everything about you, and wanted to have a nice long chat and get to know you even better. It was also baffled, an emotion which didn't exactly mesh with the rest, but it couldn't be argued. Unknown, the greater demon of Tzeentch, was baffled. The demon's power surged again, only to cut off with another psychic clang, as it ran into whatever Oak had done to turn those 3 boxes into a demon trap. It didn't try a 3rd time. "I believe this calls for a change of plan." This time there was something very different about the psychic power coming from the crushed reliquary. The warp flames illuminating the room abruptly began twisting, reaching out in 9 different directions, centered around the twitching body of the somehow still alive Untouchable. The twisting lines of warp energy seemed to pulse in time with the box, except for one, pointed more or less straight up, which was glowing with a worryingly familiar green and black tinge. It belatedly occurred to us that we should probably be doing something, as opposed to just letting the sorcery demon do all the sorcery, but by that point, it was too late. With a psychic shockwave that put everything before it to shame, the demon shattered its own spell. Unknown had weaved this spell itself,
No one else could have done it. 9 young psychers, their souls blessed and births foretold by the Changer of Ways, had been hunted down by the demon's pawns. The unstoppable force of their nascent gifts, blessings of magic and mutation beyond mortal comprehension or control, had been bound and balanced by an unmovable object of the demon's devising, an ungift. To create an untouchable was unthinkable, and therefore well within the purview of the demon's paradoxical powers. And such a walking warp void made the perfect linchpin for the spell. The hobbled humans, barely more powerful than the corpse god's blind servants, had been let loose. Carefully mixed in with the other potentials, the 9 gifted had been rescued from a cabal of conspicuously incompetent rogue traders and inducted into the Inquisition without any effort on the demon's part. Unguided and untouched by the conspiracy, they had found their ways into various retinues, unknowingly bound to each other and the ungifted interrogator by their own powers. And then, with an eager chuckle, the demon snapped his creation and freed their gifts. Throughout the system, 8 young psychers blinked as a torrent of unimaginable power flowed into them. All suddenly became clear as the true glory of the Changer of Ways dawned upon them. Reality ceased to have meaning, time became a mere suggestion, and causality was discarded as an outdated concept in the face of the sheer overwhelming power of change. And then they all exploded into demons. Lots and lots of them. Ignoring the newly formed warp portals, Unnowen chuckled in amused surprise as a single remaining tendril of warp energy twisted around, unexpectedly unable to return to its source. With a metaphorical shrug, the demon redirected it into the nearest available receptacle, and the bird-like demon host shrieked as a ninth gateway into the crystalline labyrinth tore through its being. Of course, we didn't know any of that. All we knew is that somewhere off at the far ends of the room, 2 different psychers spontaneously exploded into warp portals full of capering blue and pink demonic horrors. We just thanked the Emperor that it hadn't been fumbles who popped, and started a tactical withdrawal towards the vehicle bay. And that was before we saw the demon host explode into an even bigger 3rd warp portal. And that wasn't it, either. Just to make matters worse, the perpetually burning untouchable abruptly stopped being one. The burning wound suddenly erupted in a fountain of mutating meat and feathers, spewing forth unstoppably and flailing around like uncontrolled flesh fire hoses. Fire hoses plural. 9 of them, of course, all weaving themselves into something between a chaos spawn and a really disgusting spaghetti dinner. On top of that, the arrival of 3 gaudily armoured Chaos Marines stepping out of their respective portals was just excessive. So yeah, we felt pretty justified in our decision to tactically withdraw, and for once everyone seemed to agree with us on this. Except for the Alphamarines, of course. With a simultaneous bellow of "Target acquired!" the 3 surviving Alphamarines, as well as 2 of the ones we thought were dead, and another that we hadn't seen before, period, all threw themselves at a single target. The Crimson and Blue Chaos Marine that had just emerged from the portal, formerly known as Interrogator Host, didn't even have time to raise his big eyeball staff, much less fight back. Then, just as abruptly, the Alphamarines all vanished. Some into clouds of smoke, some into puddles of shadow, and one who had presumably forgot his Get Out of Inquisitorial Headquarters free spell, who dove into a warp portal, triggered all of his grenades, while screaming, "Hail Hydra!" The non-traitor Marine's response was less enigmatic. Bellowing at Gravis to get his ass up and bring back the damn box, the Apothecary led the 4 Deathwatch Marines in a tactical advance, keeping a withering suppressive fire on both the warp portal and the rapidly growing untouchable spawn. With an incoherent bellow and a geyser of humorous fluids, the overturned dreadnought wrenched its leg free and levered itself upward, the gelid remains of the Alpha Marine squishing under claw. His other claw held the reliquary firmly. Ari was stuck inside it, and like a concussed scramble player, Gravis clutched the flattened thing to his chest and lurched back towards his battle brothers. For our part, we raced ahead to the exit in the long-standing guard tradition of securing the line of retreat. Taking advantage of the extra breath supplied by his augmented legs, Nubby announced that those of us who had put money on everything explodes into demons should contact him in 1 to 7 weeks about getting our winnings. Twitch's more specific bet of everything explodes into demons and orcs, and demonids and more orcs, and horrors dredged from the darkest recesses of our imaginings, and more orcs, was still not technically ruled out, but Nubby would need to see at least 6 orcs before he would entertain it. Sarge barked to the little trooper to cram it, and redirected his charge toward where the elderly curatoress was attempting to drag a spasming, twitching Fumbles to safety, before he also exploded. Dropping his pulse rifle to the side, and without breaking his stride, Sarge scooped the old lady under the arm, not holding tact. Behind him, Nubby and Twitch grabbed Fumbles and booked it after Sarge, while Tink, Amy, and Doc began laying down covering fire on the mutated bat-like creatures flapping out of the portal. While our retreat was relatively unchallenged, Sergeant Gravis's was a different story. Tentacles of flesh and minor Zichin horrors clawed at the Dreadnought's heels despite his battle brothers' covering fire. The wild swings of Gravis's free claw cut bloody swaths through the demon tide, to no real practical effect. Bellowing in frustrated rage, the war machine abruptly stopped and clawed at the tangled mess of crushed metal stuck to its hand, while the wave of enemies boiled around him. With a shriek of tearing metal, Gravis ripped the box free, along with a good portion of his hand, and then, I shit you not, he threw the damn thing right at us. The tangled mass of metal sailed through the air with all the grace and accuracy, not to mention mass and speed, of a high-speed motorcycle crash. To a Guardsman, we dove for cover, the whole chunk of metal howling overhead like an artillery shell, with Spot zipping along behind. It didn't hit any of us, or the door for that matter, instead smashing into the nearby wall, leaving a massive crater and blasting 2 or 3 millennia of patina off the fresco commemorating the evolution of the excruciator through the ages. Behind us, Sergeant Gravis let out a bellow of triumph. "Handle it!" As we hauled ourselves to our feet, the Dreadnought turned back to the fight, and apparently remembered that it had been equipped with actual weapons. There was an explosion of smoke and fire, as 2 flamers, 2 chest-mounted heavy bolters, and 16 single-shot defensive smoke launchers fired at once. Even before it had been crushed, mangled, and mutated, transporting that damn adamantium reliquary would have been a tall order. Now, with it embedded a good half-meter into our wall, there was only one option. With a triumphant smirk, Tink fired up his techno-heretical plasma gun and set it to cut. Sarge hustled his payload of geriatric spies around the door jamb, the 2 of them still frantically babbling into their comm beads, seemingly completely disinterested in the current clusterfrack. Under the cover of the rest of the squad, except for Twitch, who was too busy laying mines, Tink extracted a glowing mass of scrap metal, which he was positive contained Oak's box. Somewhere. It was still a heavy and unwieldy thing, mind you, but it didn't seem to be doing anything especially warpy. Fumble seemed to be recovering now that he had gotten away from the Chaos Portals. The problem of how to carry it, and the spies, and Fumbles, who could stand up but hadn't gotten to walking in a straight line just yet, was answered for us as a familiar electric tour train rocketed out of the nearest side door. The wheelchair-bound scribe, looking decidedly worse for wear, and clutching a hand cannon as he steered, seemed to have a very clear picture of what was going on. Before the rest of us could even start moving, Tact, the curatoress, and the scribe already had their heads together, speaking what was ostensibly low Gothic, but with a speed and level of jargon that rendered it unintelligible. Following their lead and doing our best not to interrupt the 7 different conversations the 3 of them were having, we loaded up and sped off towards the motorpool, Twitch's mind's already going off behind us. The mission hadn't been so much overcome by events, as it had been overcome by full-blown demonic incursion. In an attempt to establish just how fully it blew, Sarge put his foot down, not literally mind you, that being one of the 37 acts forbade to inquisitorial visitors while the conveyance was in motion, according to the little plaque. In the firm voice of a patriarchal command, Sarge told the 3 elderly spies that if one of them didn't put their comms down and give us a briefing, he was going to have Tink turn off their Wi-Fi. This declaration earned Sarge an eye roll and a rude gesture from the curatoress as she continued her conversation, but tact took the hint. There were, to the surprise of no one, 9 demonic portals currently open, 2 more having opened inside the headquarters complex. One in the live evidence storage building, see prison, and another right on the main shuttle pad. Without a bunch of assortedly loyal Space Marines on the spot, these 2 portals have grown rapidly, as the demons or Chaos Marines leading each force opened more and more gateways. The situation up in orbit was somehow even worse. 3 inquisitorial ships were fast on their way to becoming Zechian Space Hulks, and as for the main orbital complex, Amy's mum had already given the order to break out the Exterminator's grade munitions. That wasn't all that Amy's mum was doing either. Abandoning all pretext of this not being totally premeditated, 5 regiments of guard were in the process of landing and setting up a cordon under command of Inquisitor General the Rupert. Oak's Mechanicus and Arbite allies were enforcing a cordon of their own. This time around, the Inquisitorial fleet, which was undergoing a far more protracted and indiscriminate version of the Charlie Foxtrot in the Hollow Hall. The Space Marines were, of course, loading into drop pods and firing themselves straight down into the middle of the demonic incursion, with every sign of enjoyment. The problem with TAC's brief was that none of this had anything to do with us getting one badly damaged demonic containment unit the hell out of here before it turned the entire place into a demon world. Tact nodded, and explained that this was exactly why he hadn't been telling Sarge anything in the first place. In deference to Sarge's very unamused look, the former diplomacy adept went on to explain that what we were doing was heading towards the motorpool. From there, an armoured transport would be made available to get us the frack out of there before any conspiracy reinforcements, demonic hordes, or random drop pods full of even more Alphamarines could find us. Behind Sarge, Tink opined that what we really needed from the motorpool was a cogboy who knew how these spooky demon box things are supposed to work. Tink then brandished a black cube he'd just extracted from the metal mass, and declared that he was 90% sure this part was supposed to be inside at least one of the boxes. Everyone, including the curatoress and the scribe driver, turned to look at Tink, and reminded him that Magos Smith, unfortunately, existed. Tink blushed and activated his own comm bead. It took the Mad Magos all of 5 seconds to start screaming. Tink's insistence that he had installed the tesseract correctly, and so there must be some entirely unrelated reason that it was currently outside the box, did not de-escalate the situation. With a berserk scream of outrage, the Magos announced it was time to activate Plan R, and ordered his Tau minion to ready the Xenophantasmal Warp Jammer. Tink's inquiry into just what the hell Smith was talking about, and how it was supposed to help him get the doodad back in the stupid box, was met with a piercing screech of Vox-distorted cursing. With some swearing of his own, Tink decided to just call Theo instead. According to his Tau minion, the Mago was not actually screaming over his Vox unit, just over the comnet, and actually, it was just Tink's channel. His other conversations with the buyers were continuing uninterrupted, and Theo would be sure to let us know before they activated the warp translocator. Tink's incredulous "buyers" was cut off as Nubby broke into the channel and informed Theo that he'd better not be sending any of my stuff. Theo assured him that it was just the Magos' own collection. You know, the Weird Boy, the Squig Stealers, the Demon Thrope. The choked silence was broken after a few seconds by Nubby asking how much they got for it, 'cause he knew a guy. Taking in the murderous look on Sarge's face, the cretinous little trooper broke off, whining that he wasn't the one selling it. Seemingly oblivious to all of this, Theo chatted on, assuring us that now that the warp translocator was functional, transferring the specimens would be quite easy, even with all the warp interference from the, massive demonic incursion. Tink and Doc, being slightly faster on the uptake, asked if Theo meant that Magos Smith had built a teleportarium. The Magos was apparently listening to this conversation as well, and graced us with an explanation. No, I found one downstairs, incorrectly labelled as full of bees. Tink, who had encountered and fled from said bees, began to argue only to be completely ignored. When upon even cursory analysis, they are obviously a species of parasitic warp wasp.
So you cleared them out then? Asked Sarge.
No, of course not, you simpleton. I work around them.
Ignoring the typically off-topic conversation happening in the background, Theo readied himself at the control altar of the recently refurbished and de-wasped warp translocator. Overhead, the looming form of the demon thrope emitted a palpable and scientifically measurable aura of hatred and menace. The hatred was only reading 1/9 of an angron, so there was no risk of an imminent containment breach. Fortunately. Zipping around overhead, the Mago began the pre-translocation checklist with the buyer's cogboy.
The stasis field is ready.
Affirmative.
The psi suppressors.
Affirmative.
The warp presence shroud.
Affirmative.
And they are all inside the astropathic sanctum.
Affirmative. The beacon is active and the voids have been lowered.
And you're absolutely certain there's no such thing as a demonically possessed Zorothrop, and are therefore completely unprepared for the consequences of teleporting one through the warp?
Interrogative. What?
Excellent. Tell Minion, the lever.
Theo sighed with relief as, after so long, the demon thrope finally became someone else's problem. Aboard the Nemesis-class battleship Zenodium, that served as the unofficial and very secret flagship of the conspiracy-aligned fleet, Arch-Heretic Mulder of the Dark Mechanicum looked up in shock as something far more interesting than the mere Zonothrop materialized in front of him. His augmetic brain raced to catalogue his observations, sending each fascinating datum off for secure off-site storage, even as the rest of his physical form erupted in a sudden tide of chittering insects. The Heretic's short-lived binaric scream went entirely unnoticed, completely drowned out by the triumphant psychic shriek of the freed demon throp. Even with Tink's hasty warning and his lead-lined guard-issue flak helmet, Fumble still flopped around like an electrocuted fish as the demon throp commences quote-unquote warp jamming. The rest of us had become so used to this that it barely even merited a flinch, the exceptions being the curatoress and the driver scribe, until Tat casually reassured that it was just a demonically possessed Zonothrop. From the lump of twisted metal where Tink had nearly finished extracting Oak's box, without incinerating any bits of it, the horrible demonic voice abruptly returned.
How interesting. How novel. What a truly unusual creature you've... I can't do that!
The demon box's voice rose into an indignant squawk, rather undermining the whole amalgamation of screaming souls thing. Nubby, ever the idiot, immediately asked who couldn't do what now. Sarge's automatic order not to fraternize with the greater demon of Zinch was cut off by a sudden massive increase in the demon throp's aura. Back in the hollow hall, all three of the warp portals flickered, twisted, flared with smoky green aurora, and abruptly vomited a literal tidal wave of mutated chitin as demonic tyrannies started pouring out. Sergeant Gravis paused in his battle with massive twisted chaos spawn as his unstoppably mutated flesh mirrored the change in the surrounding spell. Chitinous claws and gnashing mandibles erupted from several of the spawn's massive limbs, immediately lashing out to tear and devour everything around it, including itself. As one, the lesser Zinchian horrors turned to fight the unexpected new threat, and began raising smaller portals of their own to bring in reinforcements. Not being equipped for shrugs, Sergeant Gravis made do with a bellow of, "Have fun!" as he turned his battered chassis and determinately started stomping away from the melee, after his tactically withdrawing battle brothers.
It's not even using them right, you know. It's just manifesting mindless warp apparitions, and using my own winds to do it.
Nubby helpfully informed the demon box that
we call them demonids.
Sarge casually reached over and shoved him off the vehicle, causing the scribe to tap the plaque proclaiming, "No defenstrating occupants."
The little trooper's outraged cursing followed behind us as he sprinted along on his augmentic legs and climbed back aboard next to Fumbles. The Psycho was doing better, at least for a given value of better that includes rocking back and forth, muttering to oneself, and radiating a sense of impending doom. It was only a mild sense of impending doom, though, at least compared to all the doom currently in progress. Tink, continuing his careful peeling of the demon box, angrily told Theo to shut up about rehoming the damn demon frop, and instructing him to tell the Magos that the box was still talking. There was a blast of angry binary, and the discussion quickly returned to the topic of just how Tink and/or Oak had messed up so badly as to get the tesseract out of the box. A panting Nubby, climbing back on the cart, helpfully pointed out that it was actually a completely different tesseract, cause the squiggly sigilly thing was different, and it don't got the gold inlay neither. In a more curious tone he added, "Wonder how they got it off. I couldn't peel off any of ours, not even with a plasma torch." For the third or fourth time that trip, everyone, including the driver, turned to stare. Then the demon piped up again.
"Well, one of those two is an ancient artifact, provided directly to the Ordos Malios by its soulless creators, while the other is a random cube you found in a hole somewhere. Do you humans just assume every Necrontier leaving is a Tesseract labyrinth?"
Annoyingly, the demon had a point. Even if we had found the random cube inside an actual Necron ship, which was only coincidentally inside a hole itself. But even if our cube wasn't a Tesseract, or it had just been critically damaged by an idiot with a plasma torch, we had a Malleus certified substitute available. All we would have to do, the Magos claimed, was open up the damaged outer layer and reinsert it into the Wraithbone matrix, and then do a little troubleshooting while an enraged demon tried to devour our souls.
"Oh, yes, I agree. Do you need my help peeling the metal off?"
Tink swore, as the twisted mass of adamantine he'd been laboriously cutting through flaked off and started fluttering around like butterflies in our wake. Twitch and Amy, followed by the rest of us, started shooting them on the grounds that they were both demonic and bug-like. Tink looked at the fully exposed box and the massive cracks running through it, and hesitantly asked the Magos if he was sure this was a good idea, especially since the demon seemed to be on board with it. Smith responded with a binaric scoff, and pointed out that, "Of course," the demon agreed. It was far smarter than any of us, and started rattling off a list of tools, sensors, and rare anti-demonic wards. Tink's complaint that he didn't have any of these things was met with another scoff, and instructions to stop being a baby and improvise. Tact and the other two geezers immediately informed Tink that whatever he was doing, he was not doing it on this cart, per the clearly posted "No use of heretical artifacts while the vehicle is in motion" plaque. Both Tink and the box would have to get off. Since we'd just arrived at the vehicle bay, this was accepted without complaint from anyone but the Magos and the demon. As we disembarked, the three elderly spies immediately resumed their unintelligible code babble, only pausing to ask us if they could keep Spot to use as a secure comm relay. Tink's immediate profanity-laden response was interrupted, as the large blast doors that were the vehicle bay's main entrance cracked open, just wide enough for someone to push Jim through. The tech acolyte looked like he had a day. Not a good day or a bad day, just a day. But since our standards were calibrated for a day on the occurrence border, that did include a rather wide range. In this case, what little remained of Jim's hair was standing straight up, and little arcs of electricity kept on jumping up and down his augmentics. He was accompanied by a suspiciously oversized servo skull, which was projecting a familiar creepy smiling face. Fortunately, the creepy Holomagos didn't seem interested in us, since the skull zipped straight over to Tact, and the whole lot of them abruptly drove off without so much as a "try not to get yourself killed." Jim stared in vague confusion after the departing spies and Holomagos, and then finally registered Tink and the demon box he was holding. The cogboy made a disgusted noise and pointed out that the tesseract was supposed to be on the inside, and asked if Tink had even read the installation instructions. Tink insisted he had, and that this was a second different tesseract on loan from the Ordo Malleus.
And unlike yours, this one is actually real. You should open up this box and try exchanging them as your first step.
Tink instructed both of them to shut up, and started forcing his way through the narrowly opened door. Jim jumped backwards, began to say something, immediately thought better of it, and followed along. None of us knew exactly what an inquisitorial vehicle bay was supposed to look like, but IVG Mass 9 sure as hell didn't look like one. I mean, the room itself was as expected, but the Engiseers, Lehman Russes, and atmosphere of hectic cursing were guard issue. The fine Baneblades we were less sure about, our regiment being considered too low priority to be issued anything fancier than fifth-hand vehicular cast-offs. I mean, some of our chimeras had wheels. Amy was a different story. With an ear-piercing shriek of, "Harry!" the marksman lunged toward the nearest of the Baneblades, jumping up to swing from his massive las cannon and then violently throwing herself at the nearest Engiseer. Sergeant Dog both reflexively moved to separate her from the unfortunate cockboy before she could do any damage, but instead, to our considerable shock, she was actually hugging the short, burly Engiseer, who had popped up out of the front access hatch of her beloved Baneblade. Well, not short, exactly. He was about as tall as Nubby, and that was without his legs, which he seemed to have swapped out in favour of a wide collection of Macandadrites. Even more shocking was a cheerful "Hello!" from the furthest Baneblade, where the Rupert had perched himself for no readily apparent reason. As we jogged over, Jim and Tink already arguing with each other over the box and the tesseract. We spotted a gaggle of suspiciously well-dressed guardsmen brewing recaf over a small camp stove. Our former trainees gave us a friendly wave and cheer, but didn't actually get up. Alfred was more accommodating though, and as we approached he broke away from a pair of jittery psychers he'd been shepherding, and gave us the rundown. Actually, it was less of a rundown and more of a sprint past. The dapper psyker gestured back towards Amy, primly informed us that he had procured us transport, suggested that we get moving, and abruptly broke off with his attention fixated on Tink and the box. With an audible gulp, the psychic Batman backed up several paces and made a sort of warning gesture at us. He then apparently turned around to sprint towards the Rupert, firmly suggesting it was time they got moving. Nonplussed, the Rupert gave us a cheery wave, announcing he'd bag a salt grinder for us. The collection of Engiseers fussing over his Baneblade clambered aboard with binaric whoops and a downright orcish level of enthusiasm. Twitch eyed them suspiciously, but Nubby informed him that that didn't count. It belatedly occurred to us that we had seen no actual tank crews in the bay, just lots and lots of cogboys. That number was rapidly dwindling as a bunch of heavy servitors manually cranked the bay's exterior doors open and the Rupert, followed by the 3 other Baneblades, roared out onto the surface. Almost simultaneously, the remaining Engiseers marshalled up their servitors and fired out the door we'd entered through, immediately opening fire on whatever demonic horrors had been following us. In less time than it had taken us to cross the room back to Amy, the bay had more or less emptied, leaving just us, the burly Engiseer, and Harry. The cockboy gave our group a look over, and asked who here knew how to run a night-grade fusion reactor. Tink immediately raised his hand, as Jim made more of an sound. Sarge yanked Tink's arm back down, directing the techie to focus on the damned box, while Amy pointed at Jim. Our faithful cogboy made a bleating sound, as several thick Bacandadrites wrapped around him, and dragged him inside the massive tank. Amy told us not to worry. The machine spirits did most of the work. Nubby asked if he could drive. Everyone ignored him. As it turned out, Amy was the one who was driving, jacking a thick cable decorated with prayer seals into the socket in her skull and giggling with delight, like someone getting attacked by an overenthusiastic puppy. In a tone of familial pride, she proudly declared that Harry was the best Titan killer in the regiment. She knew because her mum would let her sit on her lap and fire the volcano cannon. The tech priest, who was also named Harry, but with an A, Amy clarified. Explained that it was only once, and it had only been a warhound, and the machine spirit was the one doing the targeting anyway. Amy complained that he was no fun, and that he was embarrassing her in front of her inquisitorial co-workers. Ignoring the surprisingly friendly banter between our markswoman and the burly torso priest, a subtype of tech priest we were getting very familiar with, we trooped inside. Heri, or the Salvation of Heretics, as the ornate gold lettering on the chassis declared it, was less a tank and more of a mobile bunker. A well-furnished one, with padded seats, recaf, and a little sign that said, "Fort Amelia, keep out," over a little cubby too small for anyone but Nubby to fit into. After a dire warning to the sawed-off trooper not to even think about it, the markswoman directed Tink to the large central chamber that shared the duties of comm-hub and mess hall. The techie, still arguing over the comms with both Theo and the Magos, dropped the demonic box on the table and started getting out his tools, while Spot hung overhead, transmitting a vid feed of his progress. The rest of us were directed to either man one of the point defense multi-lasers or get Amy a recaf. Down in the crammed enginarium, Jim protested that he wasn't remotely qualified to work with any of this. Harry the Engineer gave him conflicting assurances and death threats before scurrying away. As Amy ran through a bafflingly complex version of the Litany of Activation, Sarge belatedly realised that he'd run out of people to tell him what to do next. The squad had finally acquired transport of the most guardsmanly variety, but lacked any sort of destination. After a few fruitless seconds of pondering, Sarge asked Tink if there was anywhere we could go that would make fixing the demon box easier, and was instructed to frack off and let him work. Fortunately for our fearless leader, the tricky problem of where to go next was solved for him, when the heavy cargo elevator directly ahead of us ground to life, and a churning pile of mutated chitin rose into view. Amy scrambled for the rest of her litany, and the super heavy tank's machine spirit awakened with a chorus of beeps and slamming exterior hatches, nearly concussing fumbles in the process. In front of us, the rising pile of demonids abruptly exploded outwards in a blast of psychic force, revealing a power-armoured figure sporting an oversized headdress and an eyeball-covered staff. Amy scoffed, activated the auxiliary fire control, and without so much as a warning, fired the volcano cannon. The entire tank rattled, and Jim let out a yelp of alarm, as a ravening blast of coherent light reduced the Chaos Marine to a pair of smoking greaves. Cackling in triumph, our markswoman turned tank commander violently spun the massive vehicle around and floored it for the exit. Behind us, there was an almighty crash as something almost as big as our Baneblade smashed through the reinforced roof, followed by a swarm of screeching demonic flying fish. We, which is to say Doc, briefly debated slowing down to offer some covering fire, but the squad of yellow armoured space marines that stormed out of the drop pod seemed to have things under control. The planetary surface of wherever the hell we were had gone noticeably downhill since we last seen it. The demonic and demonic portals were already having a noticeable effect on reality, tinging the sky with pink and green light and lightning, twisting the landscape into flesh, crystals, and chitin more or less at random, and spewing both warp energy and warp entities pretty much everywhere. Up in the turret, cowering as far away from the box as possible, Vumbles let out a whimpering sound, and a wave of emotion radiated through us, mostly barely suppressed terror of several different varieties, but also a distinct premonition of doom, specifically in the form of something coming from 7 o'clock high. In the rear point defense turrets, Doc and Twitch flinched as their targeting screens jumped up to focus on a rapidly descending matte black shuttle, and the machine spirit displayed a target lock. Not bothering to question this, both troopers grabbed their respective controls and opened fire. The shuttle's own multi-laser fire splashed off Harry's armour without noticeable effect. The missiles might have been a different story if it weren't for the sudden premonition of fiery death and Amy's quick triggering of the smoke launchers. As the Baneblade skidded into another hard turn, a barrage of crack missiles annihilated the highway directly ahead of us that led up to the shuttle pad. Swearing, Amy asked the Psyker if he had a premonition about where to go next, and nodded in surprised satisfaction as a clear and smokeless vision of the roadway leading down and away into the outer perimeter pushed into her mind. As we came into the clear, both Sarge and Twitch instinctively brought their multi-lasers up to bear on the suddenly visible shuttle, blowing out one of its engines and sending it down into a roiling mass of demonoids, pouring out of the vehicle bay behind us. That more or less set the tone for our expeditious retreat. Swarms of demonic fish flyers, inquisitorial aircraft of unknown loyalty, packs of demonids, both on the ground and skittering unsupported through the air, bolts of warp lining, and the occasional precision orbital strike seemed to hone in on us from every direction. Between the tank's machine spirit and Fumble's premonitions, our attention was brought to each new threat in the nick of time. All 4 multi-lasers were firing continuously, jumping from one target to the next, with the occasional assistance of the main cannon, when something worth shooting was unfortunate enough to come across the volcano cannon's limited firing arc. It would have been quite fun if it wasn't for the damn demonic box arguing with Tink, and then Theo and the Magos about whether we were going to open it or not. Tink had achieved a level of panic previously only observed in Gretchen and Nubby. He had no desire to open the demon box, and zero faith in the Magos' assurance that it was just one layer, and the creature would barely be more powerful at all, at least not by the standards of major demons. The demon's own assurances that it wouldn't even be able to manifest a physical form, and that he was drastically overthinking things and wasting everyone's time, was even less reassuring. Not having any better options though, the techie waved Spot in, where it could transmit a clear vid to the orbital peanut gallery, jammed a highly scientific screwdriver under the box's lid, and twisted. In retrospect, unleashing a greater demon inside a contained space with a young telepathic psyker wasn't our best idea. Time abruptly ceased to have meaning, becoming something both wibbly and wobbly, not to mention disconcertingly visible, audible, and tasting slightly off-burnt recaf. No smell though, which was a bit of a relief. The increasing clarity of Fumble's premonitions exploded into something else entirely, a mind-rending maelstrom of potential futures, all playing out simultaneously and stretching off into infinity. Trying to keep track of when now was impossible, except in all the timelines we didn't. Our deaths were swift and horrific, so it was better to stick to the ones where we did. If that logic sounds circular to you, just think about what it felt like for us. Tink wasn't even trying to listen to the insane cogboy screaming in his ear about the correct procedure for opening the damaged box without breaching the one inside. Navigated by the myriad visions of his prospective frack-ups and their immediate horrific consequences, the techie worked furiously to stick to the future where the box didn't erupt in a tide of mutating pink fire or grow fangs and bite his face off. The rest of us were feeling it just as bad. Amy was laughing hysterically, steering the ungainly armoured vehicle in seemingly random patterns across the rapidly mutating terrain of the plateau. Hardly able to breathe for her laughing, and using one of her legs to fend off the levitating, twitching, pink static spewing form of Fumbles, the markswoman slewed the main gun around. Without even bothering to aim, she triggered the volcano cannon again, and a massive las cannon beam punched straight through a swooping demonic flyrant, before continuing on for half a click to decapitate the large metal-legged demon, trying to claw its way into the Rupert's Baneblade. Sarge's attention was more focused, ignoring the present Charlie Foxtrot in a desperate, leaderly attempt to figure out what the damn demon would do next. His aiming of the multi-las continuing automatically, he watched himself rapidly switch his combi through a dozen channels, barking orders with the singular authority of a non-common action. Squads of inquisitorial stormtroopers were redeployed toward the surface, and directed towards the anti-air batteries to assist Hannah, and the inquisitorial tech priests, shuttles and drop pods, were directed to new landing zones. Sergeant Gravis and his squad were directed to prepare for teleporter deployment, and Alfred was told to tell the Rupert to duck. Nobody even argued, which was definitely saying something, in case of the Lamenter's shipmaster, not to mention the squad of disaffected stormtroopers that he instructed to just frag that asshole. Doc's attention was more focused on the present, taping down the trigger on his multi-las and letting the Omnissiah take the wheel. He scrambled back through the Baneblade, pausing briefly to hold the box steady while Tink did a thing, and then reminding him that in 10 seconds it would be now. The medic dove into the enginarium with a fire extinguisher in one hand and burn salve in the other. Jim, who was screaming in Binaric as he employed Tink's stick to the timeline where I don't blow us all up strategy, was greatly appreciative of both the extinguisher and the salve, as well as Doc's assistance in jettisoning the primary heatsink array. The less said about Nubby's attempts to establish a betting pool with his various cells about his own actions, the better. At least it kept him out of trouble. Twitch, though, was actively looking for trouble. One specific sort of trouble. Trouble which he knew was coming because the Emperor had shown it to him, laid out clearly in the secret hidden patterns of his morning recap. The paranoid demolitions trooper looked forward and found the orcs, and then started working his way backwards. There were the orcs, the more orcs, and the even more orcs, and then, if them was the right word, the horrors judged from the darkest recesses of our imaginings, and then before that... As then became now, Tink triumphantly wrenched the cracked lid fully free from the box, and reality reverberated with a sigh of demonic satisfaction. Tink looked down in horror as his own premonitions abruptly coalesced into a single certain future, ending with two gloating demonic voices. One from the box and one from Fumbles, declaring,
"Prescience is wasted on mortals."
In a completely predictable repeat of our experiences aboard a certain Eldar shuttle, the horrific sensation of a greater demon clawing his way into our soul radiated backwards along with the vision. All sense of self was subsumed, all sense of time, all sense of reality, nothing but demonic cackling and helpless terror at the prospect of being worn as some sort of flesh suit. It was incapacitating, and each crawling second just brought the horrible future closer. And then, someone grabbed us by the collar and yanked us back to the present. Amy looked around in shock as Fumbles was hauled up and out of the tank by a hysterically screaming Twitch, taking the horrible visions with them as they jumped from the moving Baneblade. The front of the moving Baneblade. The marksman threw the right tread into reverse in a desperate attempt to get out of Fumbles' aura, which had the happy side effect of not crushing him or Twitch under the treads. Her attention was perhaps a little too focused on this, since she entirely missed the brightly painted safety rail, marking the edge of the plateau. Everyone inside the Baneblade was already screaming, but it switched to a higher register as the super heavy tank abruptly tilted at a severe angle and started a skidding spin down the massive scree slope below us. The only one not screaming, which is to say the demon, was complain gloating.
"Peeking ahead is unfair, you know. It spoils the surprise. But you did release me, and I am not unnowen the ungrateful. Name your unwish, and it shall be granted."
As causality reasserted itself, Sarge shouted for a sit-rep and clambered back toward the main chamber. Amy responded with a string of incoherent cursing. Doc reported a general lack of fires in the enginarium. Jim vowed to kill Amy if she fired the damn volcano cannon again, and Tink was too busy hyperventilating and staring at the freshly revealed glowy box. Nubby, seizing the initiative, explained that he got the Fair's spooky box open, and now the one inside is glowing and offering us all 3 wishes, including Twitch and Fumbles. And you guys on the box, that's 36 wishes. Sarge instructed Nubby to stop trying to scam the Greater the Demon, and pointed out that they were unwishes anyway, like the opposite of a wish. Nubby countered that that would actually be an anti-wish. Tink, remembering that he was supposed to be doing things, broke in to point out that an anti-wish would be a weapon that specifically targets wishes. Nubby declared these both to be niche, but he'd take one of each along with his regular wish.
We have a volunteer to go first, then.
Not so fast. First rule of being a Guardsman, don't ever volunteer for nothing.
So you always volunteer for something?
I mean, yeah, but not like on purpose or, willingly.
Oh, excellent. Then you're already familiar with the process.
Harry rocked with a wave of distinctly pink-tasting psychic energy, and everyone present froze. A considerable distance away, a psychic channel was briefly opened to the demonically possessed Zonothrop, alternately known as the Demon Frop, Frank, and the Xeno Phantasmal Warp Jammer, and an unwish was granted. The Astartes known as Heartmarine, Grumpy, and Comet Apothecary had abandoned their positions, much to the consternation of their interim battle brother, who hadn't gotten Sarge's teleportation warning. The three Marines rushed towards the lumbering dreadnought they'd been covering, and abruptly vanished along with it in a flash of pink light. Sarge's frantic final order to not kill the damn Demon Frop ringing in their helmets, the 3.5 Space Marines dropped through the portal and into the astropathic sanctum of the inquisitorial flagship Zenodium, right in front of a very surprised Demon Frop. After a few seconds to see if they were going to all come back, the Deathwatch Marine shrugged. The blue and white horseshoe emblem on the Marine's shoulder shimmered to be replaced with a bird and blood drop pattern, and then he stepped into a patch of deep shadow and vanished. Inside the still crashing Baneblade, Nubby pointed out that he didn't even think we could hit the Demon Frop from here. And anyway, Jim said no more using the volcano cannon. Sarge ignored him and instructed Tink to get the frack to work. The techie screwed up his face, grabbed the glowing interior box. There was a flash of pink, a flash of green, and then the lights went out.
Tell me, little technomancer, have you ever heard of the Void Dragon?
It wasn't just the lights that went out, it was the entire damn Baneblade. Amy screamed in outrage that if Tink had done something to Harry, her mum was going to kill him. Tink didn't have much attention to spare for the crashed and crashing tank though, since Spot the Wander Drone was currently trying to bash his face in. Amy, realizing that a response was not forthcoming, grabbed her pulse rifle and swore as it refused to fire on the friendly Tau drone.
There is indeed a god in the machine, just not your omnisire.
Sarge gave up on his attempts to contact Twitch as the combead went dead, and scrambled to help Tink fend off the possessed drone. His attention was caught by a brief flash of movement as something black and green scurried away from his tack light. At Sarge's shout, Nubby turned to track the skittering metallic thing and lashed out with a kick, which completely failed to connect as both of his leg augmentics locked up. As Sarge wrenched Spot off of Tink, fending off the drone's manipulator arm as it jabbed for one of his grenades, Tink registered the incredibly creepy metal leg scampering across his lap. With an incredibly girly scream, the techie lunged forward, flinging the Necron's scarab into the air and barely dodging a pulse of green light directed at his torso. Behind him, a perfectly square portion of the Baneblade's hull abruptly vanished.
You really shouldn't be toying with things you don't understand.
The bright side of Harry's new window was the clear illumination of our mighty foe. Amy redirected her aim only for the rifle to refuse to fire again, debated throwing the damn thing, decided that was Sarge's stick, and let down into the chamber while drawing her las pistol. At which point everyone went deaf, and the Necron scarab exploded. Sarge swore as 2 of Nubby's 5 hastily aimed stub pistol rounds ricocheted into his chest plate, and Tink clutched at a bleeding leg. The heroic trooper in question says something which no one heard, and then ran to grab Doc before anyone could thank him for his quick thinking. This was probably justified, since Amy was still looking to shoot something, and Spot seemed to be better now. Lacking anyone else to vent her frustrations on, the markswoman rounded on Tink and attempted to shout something about not being such a baby. Tink, equally deaf and bleeding, did not fully grasp Amy's argument, but managed to convey that he had A, been shot, and B, did not want another unwish, as the last one had gotten him shot. This was not the correct answer, and rather than continuing the pointless argument, Amy reached down and snatched the glowing interior box clear of its damaged casing. In retrospect, Amy's decision to handle a demonic artifact, while mentally interfaced with a crushing Baneblade, was not one of her better ones. Before the markswoman turned tank commander even finished lifting the interior box clear, her entire body locked up as Harry the Baneblade came back online and informed her of his displeasure, especially with the new hole and the continued crashing.
That was unwise.
Once again, there was a flash of pink and then a flash of green, not to mention another hole straight through Harry's hull. The only reason said hole didn't include Amy's face was a sharp jerk from Doc, yanking the markswoman off her feet as a small warp portal disgorged a bolt of familiar green and black lightning. Ignoring the fact that she'd nearly just gotten her face burned off, again, Amy clambered upright and declared her point proven. The stupid box was just summoning random warp portals, and Tink should shut up about his unwish and get back to work.
Oh, unsatisfied, are we?
Then the skin melted off everyone's faces. Amy shrieked in horror as her squadmate's skin slouched away to reveal the blocky augmentics and blank expressions of servitors, all laughing with the toneless voice of a dead Magos. This screaming meltdown was briefly interrupted by the long-awaited conclusion of Harry's crash. The Baneblade shook as our entire small avalanche slammed into the main access road, scattering the column of black armored chimeras crawling up it. What the inquisitorial stormtroopers thought as our Baneblade crashed through them, all weapons firing and turret spasmodically twitching in time with its driver's hysterical screaming, well, it was no surprise that so many of them opened fire. Not that anyone, save for Jim, even noticed the multi-lasers opening up on us. Doc and Sarge both moved to intercept the freaking up markswoman, to which she did not respond well. Sarge lurched backwards as a flaming foot caught him in the gut, and Amy scrambled past him and out of Doc's reach. Tink ignored all this silliness, his attention focused on the exposed platter of wraithbone circuitry at the bottom of the cracked outer box, and the tech priest screaming at him over the reconnected Vox. This left Nubby as the only one in position to block the markswoman as she attempted to eject the demonic box via one of the Baneblade's newly installed windows.
Illusions provoke a dry and tasteless terror, but they can be much more
The demonic voice cut off as Nubby's grim fingers snatched the box out of the air just ahead of a welling lasbolt coming the other way. Ignoring the near miss, the little trooper looked down triumphantly and announced that for his first wish, he wanted Owen to make a revision of the motorpool regulations vis-a-vis legitimate battlefield salvage, profits derived therefrom, and personal mercantile endeavours, Also, that one about taking all the baths. Period.
No.
Nubby's outraged reply was cut off by a badly singed Jim, informing the rest of us that the sheer volume of incoming lasfire was not helping with his badly overheating fusion reactor, and asking if one of us could do something about that. Tink casually swore at him, his attention wholly focused on the cracked circuit board, which kept screaming Eldari insults at him as he patched it. Sarge attempted to order a ceasefire, first by trying to poke his head out of one of the hatches, only to duck back down as a blizzard of lasfire targeted the new weak point, and then by trying to remember which comm channel the stormtroopers were supposed to be using. Doc informed him that this probably wasn't going to work without Fumbles helping, and applied bandages and fire suppressant as needed to Tink and Jim. Amy, having realised that her comrades had not been servitorized, and that Jim very much had a point about the fusion reactor, decided to take matters into her own hands and opened up the throttle. The super heavy tank lurched forward, smashing two chimeras out of the way, and then tilting alarmingly as it resumed its extended crash down the scree slope. Everyone, including the demon, swore at her for the lack of warning. On the bright side, not only did this get us out of the lasfire, it also interrupted Nubby's argument with the demon over whether more semicolons would make his wish valid. Sarge debated leaving the box with the little trooper on the grounds that the demon hadn't been doing anything, but then the box suggested that wishes were reserved for people who opened it. Without waiting to see how that would play out, the non-com snatched the demonic box away and clambered up through the forward hatch in anticipation of imminent demonic shenanigans. Instead, what he got was an odd demonic sense of pity.
He's an idiot, you know.
Yup. Sarge didn't even look at the demon box, keeping his eyes focused on the not very rapidly approaching forest at the base of the scree slope, and his mind as blank as possible. It didn't work.
You're an idiot too, you know.
Yup.
No, not in the sense of your depressingly unexceptional intellect.
Grunt.
I mean your foolish belief that a bunch of half-remembered lessons and a stiff upper lip would be enough to hide your fears from a being that can taste your very soul.
From below, there was a nasal, "What did mine taste like?" Both Sarge and the Demon ignored this interjection.
And such an interesting fear, too. He is not my plaything, but I'm sure his owner won't mind me borrowing his toy.
Any vestiges of Sarge's cool demeanor vanished as he looked down at the box in horror and struggled with the overpowering urge to throw it as far away from the tank as possible.
So, Sergeant, let us see how unpleasant this Bane Johns fellow really is.
There was a flash of pink light, and something slammed into the slope ahead of us with the force of an artillery round. Through the dust, Sarge spotted something that looked like a human, a bird, and a ground meat patty hauling itself upright. What Amy saw was a figure of inexplicable, literally, handsomeness, oozing confidence and looking her straight in the eye through the intervening layers of armor plating. Without thinking or even registering her own actions, the markswoman slammed Harry into reverse. If there was any doubt in our minds that the damn box had actually summoned Bane fracking Johns, it vanished, as the 30-ton Shadow Sword Baneblade tipped up on its spinning treads, began to flip, and stayed there. Rather than wait to see what the bastard was going to do next, Sarge raised his pulse carbine and fired his underbarrel flash launcher at the rapidly reforming interplanetary demon host of Mystery. Unfortunately, but not unpredictably, Sarge fired his shot at the exact same moment as Amy realized she was about to be the first tank commander in both her regiment and family history to actually flip a Baneblade over. Moving with the speed of blind panic, the markswoman spun the turret to protect the comparatively fragile volcano cannon from the impending crash. Sarge's flash grenade ricocheted off the spinning barrel with uncanny accuracy directly back into his face, followed a split second later by said barrel. Sarge blindly clung to the cannon with his armpits, while the demonic box clutched in his hand laughed maniacally, and the fully reformed Bane Johns leapt past him to perch on the rear of the improbably tilted tank. Unlike Amy, the rest of the squad knew what Bane's arrival really meant. Tink hastily yanked his tools back from the cracked Wraithbone circuit board before he accidentally sucked himself into the tesseract or something. In retrospect, he probably should have kept at least one of his hands on his work, though, because as he flinched backwards, intricate pieces of heretical xenotech slid across the increasingly tilted table to whack with a painful cracking sound right next to one of the jagged hull holes. The Magos was not pleased, especially when his hasty effort to send Spot to retrieve the thing ended with the drone wedged in said hole. It could have been worse, though. He could have been Doc. Doc's own entirely rational decision to warn Twitch about Bane's arrival ran into a slight hitch as he mistuned his comm bead. He didn't mistune it to just any wrong frequency, mind you. No, he dialed into the recently reactivated headquarters Stormtrooper TACnet. Despite being full of screams, orders and confused reports of a runaway, possibly possessed Baneblade intercepting their reinforcements, the entire network fell inconveniently silent as Doc connected and informed literally everyone that we were almost finished crashing and Oak's fracking demon box had just summoned Bane Bloody Johns. Nubby chimed in to tell him he was just 3 orcs away from winning the pool. Jim at least had the excuse of not personally encountering our stupidest nemesis, so he can probably be forgiven for accidentally doubling the techno-theologically dubious reactor's output. You know, instead of halving it to prevent imminent fiery death. His panicked binary screeching as the power conduits around him overloaded was matched by Harry's own decidedly unhappy machine spirit. Thanks to Nubby's brilliant strategic decision to do absolutely nothing, he had an excellent view from Sarge's recently vacated hatch,
as Bane grabbed the now vertical volcano cannon and manually adjusted its aim a few degrees to point at the still open warp portal above. Ignoring Sarge's curses from his perch halfway down the barrel, the fully reformed Bane host peered down through the layers of armor plating directly into Amy's soul and asked if the markswoman could lend a hand with his crazy ex. Not understanding any of what was happening, or why someone so incredibly stunningly attractive was talking to someone as plain and common as her, the markswoman triggered Harry's volcano cannon. Sarge, being rather preoccupied with keeping himself and the demon box from falling and being crushed under the Baneblade's treads, he didn't notice, as the pink light above abruptly shifted to red. The demon definitely noticed, though, breaking off its cackling comments about perhaps not returning such a fascinating toy with a sort of incredulous grunt, as something yanked away its control of the warp portal. Taking this as his cue, Sarge did the only thing he could think of and let go of the barrel, smashing down into the turret below, right as the volcano cannon fired. Nubby gawped gormlessly as something very big and very angry wrenched open the blood-red gate, not even pausing as the beam of coherent light vaporized one of its massive arms. If anything, that helped it get through the portal faster. Bane let out a panicked squeak as the hulking thing lurched down towards the improbably tilted tank and seized him around the torso with its remaining hand, and let out a growling laugh like a Lehman Russ gunning its engine. "Ow! It's Ivana! Hi, Ivana!" Sarge, Nubby, the demon box, and a good portion of the stormtroopers watching from the road above stared in shock, as something the size and strength, if not colour, of an orc war boss raised Bane above his head and hurled him down the slope below with the force of a macrocannon shell, before jumping down after it. In a frenzy of violence, punctuated by terrified demonic screaming and equally demonic laughter, the hulking figure smashed into Bane's rapidly reforming, form, and went to work like an ogre trying to break open a ration tin. The grisly scene continued for several seconds, before Bane's screaming finally trailed off, and with a triumphant roar, and a cheerful wave at Nubby with her freshly reformed right arm, the demonic Hulk hurled Bane's twisted remains back up through the warp portal before jumping through after and yanking the portal closed. "Bye, Ivana!"
I genuinely did not see that coming. Any of it.
"Oh, that was Ivana. They's a cute couple." At which point, the Baneblade finally finished crashing. We'd been in quite a few crashes in our careers, and while this one wasn't the fastest, it was definitely the biggest. All 316 tons of Harry the Baneblade slammed into the large Bane-shaped crater at the base of the slope. The laws of physics having finally reasserted themselves, the improbably vertical tank lurched forwards, sending our fearless leader flying through the scrubby, slightly mutated forest, clinging to the foothills. Sarge briefly paused his cursing and flailing as the familiar, if rather battered form of Spot the Wonder Drone sailed by, smashing into one of the passing trees in much the same manner as Sarge did a few seconds later. Somewhere behind him, Nubby asked if he was dead, and also if he still had the demon box. Sarge swore at the little trooper, which we took as a no on both counts. There was a lot of cursing inside the overturned Baneblade too. Amy was switching between freaking out over having actually flipped a throne-damned Baneblade and asking if we knew who that incredibly sexy guy with the wings was, while Jim frantically shut down the much-abused fusion reactor. Tink searched through the detritus, covering the overturned tank's roof, finally extracting the Wraithbone circuit board. Doc, having ascertained that no one present needed medical assistance or fire extinguishing, extricated himself through one of the side hatches and dragged Nubby down the slope after Sarge. Not even stopping to help Sarge out of his tree, Nubby and Doc scrambled through the brush in a desperate search for the missing demon box. Sarge did his best to guide the two, aided, at least in theory, by the Magos and Theo, who were still watching over Spot's vid feed. Nubby confidently assured everyone that he'd be the one to find it, him having a knack for this sort of thing, a sentiment which Doc not only agreed with but fully supported, being more than happy to leave this unwish stuff to the rest of the squad, which was probably why the demon gave him a little help. Following the directions being shouted at him, and not questioning just who was giving them, the medic shook a particularly battered-looking tree and shouted in panic as something dropped directly onto his helmet. Reflexively, and directly against his decision to let Nubby handle the damn thing, the medic caught the falling box in both hands. As warp energy surged around him, the medic took solace in the fact that, as bad as this would be, at least it hadn't been Twitch who'd grabbed the Summon Your Worst Fear box.
Oh, why not?
A good kilometre uphill of all this, Twitch continued his hasty descent of the scree slope, and debated what to do about all the chimeras and stormtroopers in his way. By the time he'd tranked Fumbles, crammed the Psyker into a partially collapsed maintenance shed, and mined the surrounding area, the demolitions trooper had fallen pretty far behind. Fortunately, there was a nice clear trail to follow, and a bunch of stormtroopers pointing the way with their flashlights. He briefly paused his scrambling descent as yet another warp portal opened, but broke into a full sprint when he, along with everyone else, found out just what had come through it. His debate over how best to get past the stormtroopers came to an abrupt end, as a pink warp portal opened right in front of him, and he apparently crashed into Doc's back. Both Twitch and Doc's panicked shouts were overwhelmed, as the demolitions trooper's hands closed on the falling box, and the demon started laughing. Pink lightning rose out of the box like a warpy Tesla coil, throbbing in time with the cackling demon, and branching upwards into something massive.
How novel! How delicious! How illogical and logical and unlogical! Truly, you are an artisan of paranoia. But as we all know, it's not paranoia if they really are out to get you.
Overhead, the grasping tendrils of lightning coalesced into a warp portal that stretched from one horizon to the other. It was full of orcs. Well, it wasn't completely full of orcs. There was enough space between them for a fair bit of air, ordnance, and the crushing remains of several fighter bombers. That said, it was the biggest airdrop we'd ever seen, and we were in the bloody guard. What was even more amazing, though, was the actual fracking parachutes, something previously thought beyond orcish understanding, which probably explained all the ones made of metal. Further speculation was interrupted as a large ballistic squig smashed into the overturned Baneblade with the force of a light artillery shell. As everyone else's cover-grabbing instincts activated, Twitch stood there for a second, gaping upwards as the horrible future Fumbles had shown him finally arrived, and dropped the box. Oak's carefully crafted demonic prison smashed to the ground and more of the seals cracked open. The demonic laughter rose in pitch as a tide of warp energy, pink fire, and a bird-like head erupted from the box. Twitch's literal knee-jerk decision to punt the damn thing probably wasn't the most logical or sensible, but at least it caught Owen by surprise as it arced through the air, bouncing off tree branches and orc paratroopers. Twitch's running in circles while screaming and throwing explosives in every direction was presumably more in line with his expectations. The situation was well and truly fracked. While Twitch's punt didn't break open the box any wider, thank the Emperor, by the time Sergeant Nubby managed to catch up with the thing, it had already started opening warp portals, and a second head had emerged. Lacking any better ideas, the two Guardsmen opened fire on the avian heads, which barely seemed to inconvenience the demon. The pair quickly gave up entirely as two capering pink warp things emerged from the portals. The orcs were a bit more persistent, though, and the flares of warp energy and pink light drew them in like moths to a luminator. The demon was not the only orc magnet in the area, though. The explosions radiating outward from Twitch's constantly shifting position were probably visible from low orbit, and then there was the Baneblade. The only reason that every single orc in the region wasn't heading straight for us was the very helpful distraction being provided by the column of inquisitorial stormtroopers just up the hill. Despite how appealing a proper fight was to the average greenskin, there was no way that they were ever going to ignore something as lootable as an overturned Baneblade. As Amy finally unplugged herself from the damn tank and climbed her way outside to check on both the general situation and where the hot guy went, she flinched in shock as a large figure landed right above her. The markswoman looked up at the massive, coat-sporting greenskin, wearing the battered remains of an undersized red hat on his head, and, I shit you not, doing the cane pose on the overturned tank. Amy paused for a slack-jawed second, forgetting entirely about inexplicably sexy mystery man, and then raised her rifle and blew the posturing Commissorc's head off. Inside the overturned Baneblade, Jim triumphantly crawled out of the engineerium just in time to watch Tink suck his entire work surface, along with most of his tools, into a separate dimension. Rather than comment on Tink's inability to read the clearly marked "this side up" on the tesseract control unit, the tech priest smugly declared that he'd known it had been a real tesseract, and the stupid box demon was full of shit. Tink nodded along with all of the confidence of someone who had completely forgotten about the tesseract not being real stuff, and asked if Jim could pretty please help him find the range and targeting controls on this thing. Their work was almost immediately interrupted by Amy slamming her hatch shut and screaming at Jim to get the fusion reactor back on before the greenskins got in. Jim let out a binaric whine of despair as he crawled back into the sweltering half-stack remains of the Baneblade's engineerium. From Doc's perspective, Amy's panic was a bit premature. Sure, there were nearly a dozen assorted greenskins and squiggles crawling over the crashed tank, but that was nothing compared to the sheer number he was trying to keep off Twitch with his pulse carbine. The demolition trooper's one-man artillery barrage drew in the descending greenskins like a beacon, which was presumably why he started with the mines. Even with a good 3/4 of the incoming greenskins running afoul of Twitch's explosives, Doc was still hard-pressed to keep any of them from closing on the panicking demolitions trooper, and there was nothing he could have done about the squig. Fortunately, Twitch only lost half his toes kicking the various critter away. Doc debated whether it would be possible to get close enough to bandage the badly bleeding limb in question, but his self-preservation instincts won out. Despite the fact that they were facing an increasingly unbound Greater Demon, Sergeant Nubby's front of the battle was surprisingly low-key. After dropping the first pair of pink horrors, both Guardsmen concluded that the Orcs were doing a very good job at keeping the demon and his minions busy, and didn't need their help. Before Nubby could run off to do something stupid, Sarge dragged the little trooper behind a convenient chest-high overturned tree and began to commit treachery. A quick vox to Tink confirmed that the tesseract control panel was working, and now had a range of up to 3 meters, which gave Sarge a nice clear objective. The problem was that the scrum of greenskins, lesser demonic horrors and general mayhem surrounding the target, had a radius of significantly larger than 3 meters. Unfortunately, the obvious solution involving his and Nubby's entire supply of grenades was ruled out by the necessity of not breaking the damn box any further, which meant Sarge had to go with Plan C, which was for Cretin. Reloading the launcher on his carbine and readying his supply of smokes and flashes, Sarge grinned down at his untrusty comrade and delegated the problem. Nubby, who was currently deeply regretting his insistence that "the demon box has no powers over me because he ain't given me my wish yet," sidled forward as Sarge launched his barrage. The non-com's entire supply of smoke and flash grenades sailed into the melee around the demon box, exponentially increasing the level of confusion and enraging the eyeball-covered chaos spawn that had just emerged from yet another summoning portal. Nubby sprinted through dozens of orcs in various states of belligerent confusion, ducked under the flaming arm of the blinded chaos spawn, dodged just around the edge of the warp portal, and finally yoinked the demon box. Sarge grinned in triumph as the 2 bird-like demonic heads, looming over the smoke, were abruptly yanked sideways with an outraged squawk. Nubby was less enthusiastic about the plan, at least judging by the terrified screaming, as he flailed the barely contained eldritch horror around like a floppy power sword. The demon's serpentine appendages carved a path of destruction and mutation through both the greenskins and its own minions, and the entire smoke cloud lit up with pink fire and lightning in the wake of Nubby's panicked retreat. Sarge and Dog laid down covering fire as Nubby burst out of the smoke with the demon box and sprinted up towards the overturned Baneblade. This proved to be a bit optimistic though, since the little trooper only made it a few paces out of the smoke before the demon got tired of Nubby's shit. "Unhand me." Nubby stared in shock as his hands abruptly let go of the box. Lurching to the side in a desperate attempt not to tread on the damn thing, the little trooper stumbled and smashed face first into the ground, as his traitorous arms refused to catch him. instead wrapping around his neck with long green fingers. Doc and Sarge, lacking any better ideas, opened fire on the demon's appendages, focusing on the base of an arm that it was using to open yet another warp portal. While the pulse fire didn't do any lasting damage, the barrage definitely screwed up its spell. The warp portal collapsed with a flash of pink light and a sudden rain of confused orcs. Sarge and Doc paused their firing as something like a dozen angry greenskins set to work, trying to hack off the demons' heads, aided by even more coming in from above and every other direction. Sarge pointed out that we were now in pretty much the exact situation we'd been in before, except now Nubby was trying to strangle himself. Doc's response was interrupted by a massive familiar boom, as Twitch finally ran out of grenades and switched to det packs. The Battle of Herry, circa M40.something, was a messy and chaotic affair, which made sense given it was taking place entirely within the confines of an overturned Baneblade. Amy's panicked retreat back through the side hatches has signalled an end to Jim and Tink's little Xenotech party. As Jim ran off to get the beleaguered reactor started again, Tink finished mounting the tesseract controller on Spot the Wonder Drone, and was given an excellent opportunity for field testing, as a slavering ball of teeth attempted to bite his face off. The squig, which one of the orcs had crammed through the hull holes, disappeared in a flash of green light, fortunately not taking anything else, like, say, the entire Baneblade with it. His field test successful, Tink took a cue from the greenskins and sent his own pet back out through the same hole. As Spot zipped away, the overturned tank came to life with a series of angry machine spirit noises and slamming external hatches. As a monotone voice reported 3.6 intruders detected, Tink readied his plasma gun, and for literally the first time since spending several thousand thrones on getting the feature installed, set the nozzle to mist. The .6 of the 3.6 orcs was in the engineerium, flailing madly with its free arm and leg as it struggled to get free of the hatch Jim had slammed on it. Ignoring the green skin as something far less likely to kill him in the next 10 seconds than the reactor, Jim hastily got to work while fending off the occasional thrown item and goblet of spit. The Xeno's presence was a bit distracting though, so as Jim worked, he tasked his two las-equipped Mechanidrates to finish it off. Annoyingly, this only made the Xeno more noisy, the las pistol caliber beams failing to penetrate its thick skull. With a resigned sigh, Jim recalled the two Mechanidrates, dug out Doc's fire extinguisher, and just triggered the reactor's emergency plasma vent again. Amy was too busy trying not to get killed to pay much attention to why the engineerium was on fire. Again. The greenskin that had been climbing up through the turret hatch had taken 3 shots to put down, and it was only by the Emperor's grace that none of its unaimed bolter rounds hit anything vital. Once she'd finally landed a headshot, the markswoman hastily scrambled back to reconnect the MIU cable and activated the tank's infantry defense protocol. As Harry's machine spirit activated its multi-lasers, Amy turned her attention up towards the rest of the tank, only to flinch backwards as some colossal idiot fired a anti-armor plasma weapon inside of a sealed tank. The good news was that while several cogitator banks were slagged, and the upholstery was on fire, and the entire place smelled like cooked orc, Tink had actually managed to take out both of the remaining commandos. The bad news was that despite removing a good third of its brain, Amy had not actually managed to finish hers off. The green skin she'd been standing on abruptly sat up, one hand holding its remaining brain matter in while the other raised his weapon and triggered his underbarrel flamer. Shrieking in panic, the markswoman flung herself out of the turret, not quite ahead of the blast of flaming promethium, and rolled around, cursing, as she tried to beat out the flames clinging to the blackened stump of her left leg. Barely clinging to consciousness, Amy wisely decided that finishing off the not quite dead greenskin took a backseat to survival, and ordered Harry to cycle the turret hatch. The mangled commando bellowed in outrage as it was dumped onto the ground, and with that, the perimeter was secured before Tink could fire his damn plasma gun inside again. Amy wasn't the only one sporting a fresh stump. Doc had given up supporting Twitch now that he started with the det packs, and sprinted over to give Nubby a hand with his hands. Unfortunately, the Militarum Medicae manual didn't have an entry for limbs mutated and given dark sentience by a Zichin curse, which meant it was time to get back to the basics with good old Dr. Lascutter. Nubby screamed shrilly as his left arm was severed above the elbow, a marked improvement over the patient's previous choking and writhing in Doc's opinion, and a clear sign that the treatment was working. Before the medic could capture Nubby's other limb for treatment, though, the little trooper scrambled away, insisting he and his other Gretchenified arm had reached an understanding. Doc decided not to argue. All this mayhem meant that Sarge, per usual, was the only one paying attention to the damn mission in general, and the damn Greater Demon of Tzeentch in particular. This was rather frustrating, since Sarge could recognize a tactical fracking moment when he stepped in one. Despite the loss of one or more of Nubby's limbs, his mission to extract the box from the Orc vs Demon scrum had been a success, and Sarge could see flashes of green necrotic light overhead, as Spot terrasected a swerve through the descending commandos. So when Sarge screamed at Tink to get his drone down here and tesseract the demon, he was rather unhappy to hear that the techie was a little busy trying not to be on fire. Jim was no help either, even though he was more or less fireproof at this point, resembling nothing so much as a pile of foam with augmentics poking out. Thankfully, there was a third tech expert on the call.
Attention! Those idiots! The Mago wishes me to...
Sarge informed Theo of where he could cram the Mago, and instructed the tower to get control of Spot, and send it toward the big fracking demon, now! The Xenos attempted to explain the concept of time lag and the complications of a massive warp portal being between his control station and the drone, but Sarge was not in the mood for petty excuses about the laws of physics. Shortly, but with a lot of whining and sotto voce Tau cursing, a compromise was reached, and Spot 3.0's little machine spirit had its target priorities reassigned. As the drone zipped back downwards, Theo seized the lull in the conversation to inform Sarge that the Mago is about to deploy the xenopsionic reality abuser. There was a pause as Sarge attempted to pass this, and then Theo attempted to explain. You know, the one with the squeaks? Sarge paused again, and asked just what he meant by deploy. Aboard the Occurrence Border, Theo looked between the Weird Boy's glowing, crackling stasis chamber and the ranting Magos. Observe, Tau Minion. Today we shall answer the question that has plagued mankind since I thought of it 7.325 years ago. When an Orc Psyker is overwhelmed with unfathomable levels of xenopsionic energy, what do we call it? Is it a Gork host or a Mork host? Theo pondered this, and then informed Sarge that it was deploy as in strategic class ordnance. He should probably duck or something, and not look directly at any warp portals. Sarge swore as the Theo started counting down. Twitch, who was apparently still on the comms, screamed at everyone to hit the dirt and prepare for the great insquiggening. Ignoring all of this, Sarge focused his attention on the swiftly descending form of Spot the Wonder Drone, and realised he might have been mistaken about that whole tactical moment thing, because Sarge was not the only one following Spot's descent. While two of the demon's limbs were opening new warp portals, and another was throwing spells at the odd pursuing greenskin, one of his heads had its gaze focused on the approaching drone. Realising that he had well and truly fracked up, Sarge did the only thing he could think of, and screamed at the rest of us to do something. Inside the Baneblade's smouldering interior, Tink abandoned his unimportant job of keeping himself and Amy alive in favour of a far more important matter. Yanking out his drone controller, the techie mashed the first few buttons he could find in a desperate attempt to save his waifu. Fate was on our side, as it turned out, because one of the buttons Tink hit was Spot's newly installed chaff function. In a flash of necrotic light, the drone reversed its tesseract, and the area between it and the demon was abruptly filled with dozens of confused and belligerent orcs. Several bolts of homing demonic fire smashed into the falling greenskins, as the drone veered away into a holding pattern, and Sarge breathed a sigh of relief, which was when the Weird Boy detonated. The warp portal above us exploded. Theo had not been kidding about the strategic class ordnance part, and there was a blast of raw psychic energy that dwarfed even the greater bloody demon in front of us. Both of the creature's bird-like heads screeched in outrage as his own newly formed portals unravelled in a blast of green lightning, and that was nothing compared to what the shockwave did to the greenskins. The orcs bellowed as power boiled through them, swelling their muscles to grotesque proportions and infusing their weapons with sparking green energy, except for the ones that just exploded or turned into abnormally large squigs. Howling their traditional "wah" cry, the empowered greenskins held themselves toward the demon, and from the sounds of things, they were actually causing some real damage. Sarge confidently announced that this was actually the tactical moment. Probably. Tink and Amy barely even noticed all of this, since Jim had finally run out of fire suppressant, which meant it was time to abandon land ship. Amy ordered Harry to open the turret hatch, and both she and Tink dropped unceremoniously onto the nice cool ground. The sense of relief was slightly spoiled by the large, cranially impaired greenskin standing over them, boiling with green lightning, which then exploded. Amy cursed as she was once again doused with orc bits, while Tink screamed that now his legs had been blown off, or at the very least fractured. So it was easy to see why neither of them were in the mood for Sarge's tactical moment BS. The non-com was insistent though. We had until the demon and the glowing greenskins either killed each other or got bored to set things up for our final attack. Sarge, Doc and Nubby would get in position to lay down covering fire while Amy sniped the demon. Tink used his plasma gun to cover Path a spot, and Twitch would ruin everything by throwing a jetpack right into the middle of our distraction. Despite Sarge's well-honed reflexes, he didn't quite make it to the ground before the jetpack went off. He was thrown over backwards by a blast of heat and orc bits, and a large ballistic orc limb clocked him squarely in the helmet. Fighting to maintain consciousness, the non-com hauled himself upright to groggily make eye contact with a large squig wearing combat boots and a bandolier. Per the laws of narrative causality, Twitch regained his composure just after literally blowing Sarge's plan out of the proverbial water. A quick look around was enough to confirm that the glowing orcs were both real and surprisingly durable, with several of the ones he just jetpacked already getting back up. Nearby, Doc was down and swearing at Nubby, who ducked behind him just in time to dodge most of the shrapnel, and was now staring in confusion at the green glowing arm that seemed to have regrown when he wasn't looking. Twitch hastily popped a stim, and announced that he had fracked up and was sorry. Nubby shrugged, both green arms cooperating now, hit both himself and Doc with stims, and reassured Twitch that we'd all fracked up. Amy and Tink both cut in to object to Nubby's comment, only to immediately accuse each other of crashing and setting fire to Harry the Baneblade, respectively. Ignoring the argument, Jim, who had actually done nothing wrong, descended from the smoking wreckage of the Baneblade and asked Sarge whether it was still the tactical moment or not. Sarge swore, assured everyone it was, and just as soon as he finished sorting things out mano a squigo, he was going to prove it. Tink was understandably dubious about Sarge's assertion, but a quick check of Spot's vidfeed proved the non-com almost right. The demon's box had somehow emerged from the explosion unscathed, and the writhing pink limbs were preoccupied fending off the most obstinate of the Wa-infused greenskins. Spot really could get close enough to tesseract the demon, provided he had a bit of covering fire from the squad's heavy weapons. That would be tricky though, since Harry wasn't going anywhere, and neither were he or Amy, unless their own limbs conveniently regenerated. Jim coughed and asked whether Tink or Amy wanted him to carry them up to the lip of the crater. Tink rejected this offer, declaring that he'd have his hands full with Spot, and thrusted his plasma gun at the tech priest, with instructions to do his best. Jim declined, backing away, only to run into something much worse as Amy grabbed his leg and asked whether Harry's capacitors had one last shot in them. Jim looked at the heavy cable still connecting the markswoman to the half-slagged Baneblade, and checked to see that the volcano cannon really was both intact and pointing roughly the right direction. With a sigh, the tech priest announced that yes, Harry's capacitors did indeed have one last shot in them, at least if she didn't mind them, followed by Harry's reactor, followed by everything in the immediate vicinity being reduced to subatomic particles. The markswoman merely nodded, and stated it was for the best. This way, her mother would never have to know the shameful truth. Amy and Tink began shouting orders, which were generally ignored since Doc was busy patching up all the holes the air-bursting greenskin had left in him. Sarge was still duking it out with the squig, and Nubby wasn't paying attention. This just left Twitch to use his fracking marker light for once in his fracking life. Confirming that Tink and Amy were ready, Twitch leaned out of cover, and sighted on the glowing, levitating box. Unfortunately, the demon was ready for something like this, and Twitch didn't even get his weapon fully raised before one of the demon's burr-like heads turned to pin him with its gaze. Twitch screamed as demonic laughter filled his mind, growing increasingly malicious and guttural as the last fragments of his sanity finally shattered. Nubby peered his head over his own cover, and helpfully informed everyone that Twitch had screwed up again. And on that note, he was feeling a lot less confident about going next, and suggested that maybe it should be someone not habitually, possibly genetically inclined to colossal frack-ups. Nubby wasn't really asking, as Doc suddenly learned when the little trooper grabbed him by the chest plate, pushed the medic's pulse gun into his hands, and then hauled the poor bleeding Doc up to the edge of cover with instructions to "Do the thing, while I does the other thing." Doc stared at Nubby, attempting to bring the little trooper into focus, and began to ask what any of this was about, only for the little trooper to spring up straight toward the box with his Gretchen-y arms outstretched, declaring that Owen still owed him his wish and/or anti-wish. Owen was unamused, shrieking with demonic rage, both heads, as well as 2 clawed limbs, all whipped towards the annoying little trooper. Nubby screamed and immediately reversed direction, and then reversed several more times while scrambling to dodge a barrage of demonic pink and blue fire, interspersed with the occasional lightning bolt. Doc, belatedly realizing that he was expected to do something, other than, bleeding out, activated his marker light. Amy and Tink were far less ready than Twitch, or Nubby for that matter, had assumed. As the marker light signal registered, the pair were still arguing over whether they needed a second separate marker light for the covering fire. Sarge, arm deep in a squig, and not happy about it, cut in to direct the markswoman to "Just fracking eyeball it!" With a frustrated growl, Amy raised the overturned Baneblade's volcano cannon to match the line of her pulse rifle and ordered Harry to fire. As it turned out, Amy's careful aiming was a bit unnecessary, since the blast that came out of the volcano cannon was something more akin to a badly tuned melter gun than a pinpoint lascannon strike. Amy shrieked in surprise and pain as the crater was flooded with the backblast of searing heat and semi-molten rock. That was getting off easy, though. Everything downhill of the Baneblade, on the other hand... Un-Now-En, the Unseeing, lived up to his name, not looking away from Nubby until the ravening blast of energy rolled over it, annihilating its 4 exposed appendages and blasting apart the box that Amy had been trying so hard to miss. Not to mention several hundred cubic meters of rock and greenskin. Fortunately, it didn't matter, because Owen only got 37 milliseconds to enjoy his sudden freedom. This was the time it took for Doc's marker light to re-establish lock on the emerging demonic figure. Spot, the Wonder Drone, zipped forward, barely above the poorly focused energy blast. Then, as its sensors reacquired the target, it drove in and activated the tesseract. A silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by sizzles and cracks, as the large molten gash in the hillside cooled and hardened, and then by a clattering crash as Spot 3.0 failed to pull out of its dive. The psychic shockwave of the demon's sudden absence could be felt all the way in orbit, which was incredibly convenient for Sergeant Gravis, who had actually been growing tired of bashing the demon trope's skull in to establish dominance. The apothecary had tried to tranquilize it, despite Gravis' advice not to bother, but nothing short of repeatedly flattening his metal-plated head seemed to do the trick. But now, at long last, 2 massive ichor-stained power fists clenched tight and tore the writhing mass of chitinous flesh and living shadow in 2, and then 3, and 4, and so on, until the thrown damned screeching finally stopped, and the cursed thing fled back into the warp. Behind him, his 3 battle brothers cheered as the demonids around them faded into smoke, and the warp portal slid closed. The former astropathic sanctum of the former ship, Gravis was not entirely clear which ship, but probably not the occurrence border, thank the Emperor, didn't appear to have a readily accessible landing pad, but Sergeant Gravis was damned if he was going to let some cogmarine try to teleport him out of this place. The Lamentor's Thunderhawk that picked up their retrieval beacon was surprised to find a dreadnought with 3 Space Marines mag-clamped to it floating in space, but judging by the condition of the demon-infested wreck beyond them, this was probably an easier pickup. There was no Thunderhawk extraction coming for us Guardsmen though. And no Valkyries either, since even if the giant orc-spewing warp portal had finally fizzled out, there was still the matter of all the shrieking demonic fish things, anti-air fire, and the sudden resumption of orbital strikes. With the brief silence broken, Amy started alternating between incoherent groaning and swearing, as she registered her new burns and even shorter leg stump. Mustering what was left of her will, the markswoman declared that at least it hadn't been the face, for once, and passed out. A surviving commando clambered up with a pained "Whoa," and Twitch started screaming hysterically while hosing the offending greenskin with pulse fire. Ignoring the brief firefight, Tink reported the blatantly obvious fact that Spot had been successful, and then asked if Jim could come carry him once he finished determining if the Baneblade was exploding or not. Jim swore at him without looking up and instructed the techie to crawl over and help Amy before she bled out, or no piggyback rides. Doc was in similarly bad shape, the burns inflicted by the poorly focused volcano cannon tapping out his last reserves and leaving him unconscious. Nubby didn't think he was going to bleed out right now, though, and there was still the matter of that remaining wish and anti-wish he'd been promised. Sarge returned from his showdown with the squig, missing both his combat knife and right arm up to the shoulder. In retrospect, trying to stab a squig in the face hadn't been his best tactical decision, but he still had his pulse rifle and was ready to marker-light something just in case. He was disappointed but relieved to find Nubby crouched over a pile of drone scrap where the demon box had been, while Twitch brandished his pulse rifle in the small trooper's face. Sarge watched as Nubby kept digging, ignoring the gun in his face and casually assuring Twitch that it had just been his arms, and they reached agreement anyways. As Nubby pried loose the surprisingly intact tesseract controller tablet and verified that the Necron QB thing was still properly in place and all the lights was on, Twitch abruptly yanked the device away, screaming that the little trooper couldn't be trusted. Sarge took this as a good sign vis-a-vis the demo trooper's mental state, appointed him tesseract holder, and went to go find Doc in his medkit before anybody bled out. Sarge's bandaging was interrupted by a report from Jim that, yes indeed, Harry the Baneblade would be exploding and we had 3 minutes to get out of there. Given Doc's unconsciousness, Amy's legless unconsciousness, and Tink's insistence on piggyback rides, Sarge was not optimistic about our chances, but you had to try. Before Sarge could decide on a direction though, Twitch ran over to Tink and shoved the Tesseract controller toward the techie with one hand, while brandishing his pulse rifle with the other. Something in Twitch's incoherent babble and violent gesturing got the message through, and Tink hastily took out the other, supposedly not a Tesseract, and exchanged it for the one full of greater demon. Tink did understand why removing the demon-filled Tesseract was important, but didn't grasp why Twitch wanted the other one until the demo trooper yanked the controller back and scrambled up the lip of the crater with it. Jim yelped in alarm as the ominously humming wreck he just climbed out of vanished in a flash of necrotic light. The tech priest announced that he had been sure that it had been a Tesseract since they had, actually tested it, and it was a good thing nobody had thrown it away. Twitch wasn't listening, preferring to cackle madly and limp around the crater, tesseracting up the still twitching greenskin bodies that had been underneath. Since the whole exploding Baneblade problem had solved itself without him needing to do anything, Sarge decided that we might as well rebase to the vacated Baneblade crater and fort up. With the Doc draped over his remaining shoulder and the medkit strap clenched in his teeth, Sarge charged past where Tink was patching up Amy and unsympathetically dumped his cargo into Jim's exhausted lap, while he turned to survey the tactical situation. Without Spot, the team's combis couldn't reach orbit, so Sarge started flipping through the usual guard channels. He immediately regretted this decision as a booming voice started screaming in his ear, and futilely tried to switch the channel until he realised whatever it was being broadcast on all frequencies. It was an automated message, on repeat, informing all Imperial forces that the Ordo Malleus had subdued the demon and was initiating containment and cleanup protocols. All ground units were to take up containment positions and hold all inquisitorial agents for debrief. Sarge didn't need the little psychic voice in his head to tell him that he didn't want to know what an Ordo Malleus debriefing consisted of. Sarge thanked the voice for its concern and asked if that really was Tak's voice he was hearing and not just a blood loss-induced hallucination. Tact instructed him to shut up and get the frag out of the area before he got captured and fracked up a century and a half of his work. As an afterthought, he told us to try not to die. Unless we'd gotten the Lady General's daughter killed, in which case death probably was the best option. Sarge asked if Tact could tell him something he didn't already know, and the annoyed inquisitorial bureaucrat wobbishly asked if he knew about the Cathedral of Containment being orbitally dropped on our position. Sarge looked up at the steadily growing identified falling object burning down overhead, and agreed that he had been wondering about that. Tact, still not having said anything useful, signed off the psychic call with a complaint that he had to go and deal with the Lord Inquisitor now. And Oak. Sarge decided that don't get caught and try not to die were good enough orders to roll with, which meant it was time to follow the NCO disaster response checklist. The perimeter was secure, at least judging by all the green flashes as Twitch continued his rampage. The chain of command was useless, and the backup would probably kill us and convert our carcasses into servitors, which just left finding some friendlies ourselves. Fortunately, when you're in the guard, you've got a lot of friends. Sarge declared his intention to go and make contact with that column of stormtroopers that we'd crashed through on our way down the hill. Admittedly, there might be some hard feelings about the crash, and they were firing more or less in the squad's direction, but Sarge was sure that as long as we kept Nubby at the back of the group, they wouldn't mistake us for greenskins. Jim rasped a sigh through his secondary vocoder, having lost both his primary and biological versions to the fire, and asked Sarge if he was certain he'd understood the bit in the Vox broadcast about all inquisitorial agents being held for debrief. Sarge assured the child tech priest that he sure as shit didn't see any inquisitorial agents around here, but he'd be certain to report to his fellow guardsmen if he saw any. Jim ceded the point with a shrug, and gestured his sole remaining Macandrodite in the general direction of the green flashes, and Twitch's maniacal laughter. He asked if Sarge intended to explain the demo trooper's new favourite toy as an oddly flat, green and wraith-bony lasgun. Sarge was still pondering the problem of the hysterical demo trooper and his blatant archaeotech when Nubby sidled up and reported the issue. "Taken care of, boss!" Sarge idly cussed Nubby out for using a non-standard address to a superior officer before catching up with what he'd just heard and realising the green flashes were getting more and more distant. Before he could ask, Nubby volunteered that Twitch had volunteered. You know, for rear guard. Like, covering our escape and all that. Sarge groaned, asked whether Twitch had actually volunteered for anything, and was not amused with Nubby's "probably." The cretinous little trooper rushed to explain that it wasn't like he'd suggested, well, anything. The crazy bastard had been babbling about trying to catch that big rock before it lands and unleashes an unstoppable tide of my kind on this world. Sarge grudgingly admitted that Nubby was probably right. At Sarge's order, a carrying harness was fashioned for Amy out of her own weapon strap and half a roll of duct tape. Hefting Doc with his remaining arm, and staggering under the weight of the two unconscious guardsmen, he began leading the way uphill. Behind him, Tink and Jim supported each other in a sort of drunken tripod, while Nubby fiddled with the Necron cube thingy, last seen in Tink's possession, muttering under his breath about his damn wish. Sarge ordered him to stop playing with the Eldritch dimensional prison thingy before he unleashed a pissed-off greater demon on our asses, and stashed it somewhere it wouldn't be found until we got to Oak. As the exhausted party trudged up the hill, the massive glowing form of the descending fortress shifted slightly to track the intermittent green flashes cutting through the no man's land below. The stormtroopers of the Inquisitorial 703rd were surprised to see us coming up the hill, not having expected anyone to walk away from that Baneblade crash. The surprise was nothing compared to learning just who had been driving said Baneblade. Word that Lady General von Huppingding's daughter had been recovered and needed medical treatment and extraction galvanized the stormtroopers even more than the previous demonic incursion and surprise orc invasion. Treating the battered squad like some sort of high honor guard, everyone was rushed into the nearest Medicaid tent, where Amy was immediately jumped to the front of the queue, followed, after a brief triage, by Doc. Jim and Tink were instructed to walk it off, and Sarge was given a spot somewhere in the middle. Clenching his line number in his remaining hand, and desperately wishing it was a beer instead, Sarge went back out of the Medicaid tent to find Nubby still arguing with the sentries and their gene scanner, maintaining that if his DNA registered as an inquisitorial stormtrooper in good standing, with citation for exemplary service in the protection of a bunch of fracking scribes, they didn't need his throne-damned fingerprints. Asking the sentries if they really wanted to see more of Nubby's skin, Sarge diffused the situation, dragged the little trooper over toward the Medicaid tent, and sat down next to Tink and Jim to watch as the massive, glowing orbital cathedral of demon containment smashed into the ground. Once again wishing for a beer, Sarge saluted the flashes of green light coming from somewhere near the cathedral's base and started counting down to the inevitable. Twitch laughed maniacally as he scrambled down the hillside through the battlefield, cutting a swath through the greenskin hordes with his brand new Xenotech Orc Eliminator. A small, still sane portion of Twitch's mind knew it wasn't just greenskins being sucked into the Ordo Malleus cube thingy that powered his new weapon, but it had decided to stop worrying about that. Instead, it was chewing over that other group of orcs it had seen. The Gretchen had to have been either Nubby, or the world's bravest Grot, and the two mech boys that had been fitting with his new weapon had to be Jim and Tink, but he hadn't been sure about any of the others. All he could see when he looked at them were hulking greenskins barking at each other in their own guttural language, which was unfair, since Twitch did in fact know Orcish. None of that really mattered though, because Twitch's mind, sane or otherwise, was just along for the ride at this point. It had taken a heroic amount of effort to fight back the panic long enough to figure out what he had to do to fix everything. His orcified comrades had just stared blankly at him, as he clearly explained that they needed to take the box with the demon out of the thingy and put the empty one into it before tank could go boom. After how much effort that had taken, Twitch hadn't even tried to convey his desperate plan to throw the inevitable inquisitorial pursuit, conspiracy and otherwise, off their trail. So instead, once he'd tesseracted the exploding Baneblade, Twitch had turned himself downhill and let his adrenaline take the reins. Despite the horror surrounding him, Twitch kept laughing, because even if he was beset on all sides by greenskins in increasingly odd attire, and even if there was what appeared to be an entire rock full of them descending straight at him, he held the answer to all of his problems quite literally in his hands. It was hard to be afraid when wielding a Xenotech weapon that quite literally deleted his enemies. There wasn't even shrapnel to worry about. Unfortunately, that feeling of invincibility ended before he got a chance to see if the rock would fit inside his new toy. Midway through his rampage, the Xenotech tablet informed him that it was at 25% remaining charge and promptly deactivated. Cursing Tink, Theo, Smith, Jim, and all tech priests in general, Twitch tried to yank the Necron cube out and activate it by hand somehow, but he barely even reached for it before the tranq darts hit him. The first thought to skitter across Twitch's mind as he regained consciousness was that orcs definitely didn't use tranq darts. And now that he had a few spare seconds to look around, the only action he was capable of, the orcs around him were decidedly half-assed. He was almost certain that there was no such thing as an Inquisitor, and even if there were, they wouldn't be caught dead wearing fancy robes with Chaos Squigglils written on them. Twitch dearly hoped that this was all Owen's fault, because he would have liked to have believed that his own mind would have put a little more effort into his sudden but inevitable mental breakdown. The large, dimly lit chamber was filled with guttural chanting and flashes of warpy light, as the crowd of impostorks did whatever the hell they were doing. Whatever it was, this did not appear to involve Twitch in any way, since he was being held to the side of all things by a pair of servitorks. These he was less sure about. He had, after all, seen them before. At least, he was doing better than the long-haired Ordo Morcus Inquisitor chained in the middle of the ritual circle next to the glowing Necron box. Twitch was indignant at this misuse of his property, and attempted to inform the servitorks holding him of this grave injustice, but all that came out was a few panting giggles and a stream of drool. They seemed to understand and sympathize with his plight. Oddly,
Despite all the comically inaccurate Inquisitorks and the Spork Marines and the throwdown Sistork of Battle, one of the greenskins didn't look stupid. Twitch eyed the out-of-place commando. Unlike the others with their stupid hats, the commando sported a highly effective cardboard Space Marine mask and had emblazoned his chestplate with "Stupid Beaky." In fact, the illusion was so good that, for a second, Twitch was pretty sure it was a commando, but the way it stepped from shadow to shadow was distinctly un-orky. Commandos, he was pretty sure, had to cross the ground between the shadows too, or at least that's what he hoped. Twitch couldn't move his head or anything really, after being shot full of those darts, but he could still control his eyes, and he focused them on the odd greenskin as it stepped out of the pillar next to the two servitorks and their captive.
Oi, psst, Humie, what's in the box?
Twitch struggled, and between giggles managed his answer.
Orcs. Orcs? Full of orcs, but not like you. Orcs, double orcs, and hairy. Box full of hairy orcs?
Twitch grinned maniacally, unable to force any more words out. And then, to his surprise, the commando lifted up his mask and grinned back.
Bloody classic, that. Exactly what I would have done. Nobody ever suspects the hairy orcs.
And then the orc was gone, leaving Twitch alone with the chanting of the probably not orcs rising to a crescendo. And then they opened the box. In a flash of green necrotic light, the centre of the chamber was suddenly filled with a massive heaving pile of orcs, squigs, every single grenade, landmine, and miscellaneous inflammable that Twitch could find on his rampage through the no man's land. And somewhere deep in the middle, one very, very unhappy Baneblade. Mustering the last of his strength, Twitch cackled triumphantly as the massive pile of greenskins and ordnance detonated. As the partially slagged chamber cooled to nearly survivable levels, the pristine black form of a Deathwatch Marine with a Raven badge on its shoulder stepped out of a pool of shadow near the crater in the room's centre and descended to claim the unscathed Necron cube sitting in its lowest point. By the time the assorted Ordo Malleus underlings got up the courage to check on their bosses, he was already gone. Thin.